Beautiful. Alright, we are going live. I believe the stream has begun. Okay, so I just saw that Shaun has posted a bell curve critique, apparently well reviewed by a number of people, has a couple 100,000 views, so maybe we'll see what all the fuss is about. In the meanwhile, I encourage people to check out my Discord, and if they want to get on voice and discuss anything with me, they can go ahead and do that.
By psychologist Richard J. Herrnstein and political scientist Charles Murray, and by way of an introduction here, I'll read the description of the book that's on the back of my copy. Breaking new ground and old taboos, Richard J. Herrnstein and Charles Murray tell the story of a society in transformation. At the top, a cognitive elite is forming in which the passkey to the best schools and the best jobs is no longer social background, but high intelligence. At the bottom, the common denominator of the underclass is increasingly low intelligence rather than racial or social disadvantage. The bell curve describes the state of scientific knowledge about questions that have been on people's minds for years, but have been considered too sensitive to talk about openly. Among them, IQ's relationship to crime, unemployment, welfare, child neglect, poverty, and illegitimacy, ethnic differences in intelligence, trends in fertility among women with different levels of intelligence, and what policy can do and cannot do to compensate for differences in intelligence. Brilliantly argued and meticulously documented, the bell curve is the essential first step in coming to grips with the nation's social problems. Even though it is now 25 years old, the bell curve's ideas have had quite the lasting impact. Richard Herrnstein passed away shortly before the bell curve was released, but the other author, Charles Murray, has in recent years, among other things, been on an episode of Making Sense with Sam Harris. He's been interviewed on Stefan Molyneux's YouTube channel, had his ideas discussed on the Joe Rogan podcast, and regular viewers of my channel will remember the bell curve being cited in a recent Stephen Crowder video. At the time of the book's release, the backlash against it in certain sections of the media and scientific community was furious. Dozens of articles were written by scientists and journalists attacking the book, studies were conducted to debunk its claims, whole books were written to debunk its claims actually, and these criticisms were often phrased very harshly. Columnist Bob Herbert, writing for the New York Times, described the book as a scabrous piece of racial pornography masquerading as serious scholarship. Mr. Murray can protest all he wants, wrote Herbert. His book is just a genteel way of calling someone the N-word. This controversy ignited by the bell curve has also had quite the lasting impact. When Charles Murray is invited to speak at college campuses, for instance, people turn out in protest, often with angry cries of racist, eugenicist, and so on. And from the enraged reaction to the bell curve, a new reader might expect the book to be blatant and unapologetic racist propaganda, a neo-Nazi screed arguing for the supremacy of the high IQ white race and such things as that. However, when we actually sit down and read the book, things aren't quite that simple. Consider the following quotes. If tomorrow you knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that all the cognitive differences between races were 100% genetic in origin, nothing of any significance should change. The knowledge would give you no reason to treat individuals differently than if ethnic differences were 100% environmental. In any case, you are not going to learn tomorrow that all cognitive differences between races are 100% genetic in origin, because the scientific state of knowledge, unfinished as it is, already gives ample evidence that environment is part of the story. If the reader is now convinced that either the genetic or environmental explanation has won out to the exclusion of the other, we have not done a sufficiently good job of presenting one side or the other. It seems highly likely to us that both genes and the environment have something to do with racial differences. What might the mix be? We are resolutely agnostic on that issue. As far as we can determine, the evidence does not justify an estimate. For virtually all the topics we will be discussing, cognitive ability accounts for only small to middling proportions of the variation among people. It almost always explains less than 20% of the variance, to use the statistician's term, usually less than 10% and often less than 5%. What this means in English is that you cannot predict what a given person will do from his IQ score. So what's going on here?
Since then, the state of the art has progressed a fair amount, although I think that even for the time, Charles Murray and Herrnstein were pretty conservative in terms of what claims they would actually make. Hey, Eternal Fisherman, good to see you. Good to see you, Babs. Let's see.
It seems
the
from
meteor
quotes,
stuff
anyway,
might be
that the bell
later.
curve is actually a fairly reasonable piece of work. These are all relatively mild, middle-of-the-road statements here, so this hardly seems like a scabrous piece of racial pornography so far. Charles Murray has used quotes from the bell curve, such as we have just read, to defend himself and his work against accusations of racism. Arguments in the bell curve. Firstly here, let's just as we can. After that, we'll move on to you can drop. Exactly. First problem here is with some mix of intel. Well, how about the ability to write a great novel? These and groups of activities that could fall under this definition of which is
okay. This is going to be interesting.
I'll include time codes to all of these sections below, so you can drop out and come back as needed. Right then, let's get started. And if we're going to be reading a book that is about intelligence, we should start off by briefly talking about exactly what that is. Let's imagine that we want to design an intelligence test from scratch. And to do this, we first have to answer two difficult questions. The first is, how exactly do we define intelligence? And this is a particularly tricky thing to do, as we'll see. Let's start with the dictionary definition of intelligence, which is as good a place to start as any, I suppose. And this is from the Oxford English Dictionary. Intelligence is the ability to acquire and apply knowledge and skills. Now, our first problem here is that this definition is rather broad. Think about all the activities and groups of activities that could fall under this definition of intelligence. Is one's ability to solve complicated mathematical sums governed by intelligence? How about the ability to solve a difficult chess puzzle? I'd imagine we'd say those things are associated with intelligence, right? Well, how about the ability to write a great novel or compose a great piece of music? Are those things influenced by intelligence, or would we merely call that creativity? Is knowing whether to pass or shoot in a game of basketball?
Right. This is an issue that is totally without any weight whatsoever. We define intelligence merely as the clustering of certain abilities that we would call cognitive abilities. So basically everything that one would intuitively think falls into this basket does. So people think, oh, well, someone's really good at math, they must be smart. Well, math is very G-loaded, meaning that it's in this cognitive cluster. People say someone is really good at writing or reads large novels or says big words is smart. And again, that's in the cluster. Vocabulary size is in that cognitive cluster, which we call which we associate with the G factor. And so this problem is solved. It does not exist. It just means that this definition of intelligence is very simplistic and does not align with more sophisticated theories, or with more, I would say, with attempts at creating a huge multimodal group of categories where everybody gets to be the best at something. But the fact remains that we have these cognitive clusters. People who are good at math tend to be good at analyzing literature, tend to be good at learning languages, tend to be good at chemistry, all that sort of stuff. There is that cluster, and we call that intelligence. And that's just what we do. And this is useful. It goes along with success in a whole range of things. So there's no problem of defining it. It's just that this definition is not satisfactory to many people. But it doesn't matter whether it's satisfactory to you. All that matters is that we can make predictions with it. And so, again, this criticism is entirely without weight. It does not mean that we can't use the construct intelligence or general intelligence to do what people do with it. Indeed, people are generally very overcautious in applying conclusions about what less general intelligence or more general intelligence means. It does straightforwardly tend to mean exactly what you would expect it to mean. Hey, EgyptoBot. Hey, everyone. Good to see everybody here.
Basketball or football influenced by intelligence, or would we merely call that talent? Or are all of these things some mix of intelligence, talent, and creativity? We can certainly imagine a novel that is written intelligently, for instance. Could we say this is some sort of creative intelligence, or are intelligence and creativity strictly two entirely different concepts? Is there a difference between memorizing...
Yeah, we don't care. None of these things matter at all. This quantitative cluster of performance predicts a lot of stuff, like your country's proclivity to have a space program, or launch satellites into orbit, or create good pharmaceuticals, or have good infrastructure. All that sort of stuff is correlated with wealth, which is correlated with intelligence. Right? There's a very strong correlation between intelligence, by which I mean general intelligence, construct G, which when you take outside outliers of resource economies, those will get wealthy through exporting oil or exporting minerals. There's a very, very high correlation indeed between your country's intelligence and your country's wealth, right? And from that to many, many other things. So there's no problem here if you're talking about using it to predict things. There is a problem if you want to fit it into a very sophisticated pie-in-the-sky bullshit idea of what intelligence is. But nobody should care about that. All that should care about is the ability to make predictions. And this very simple definition of intelligence as that cluster of abilities which tend to go together, that works. That works, and it makes good predictions, and there's nothing more that needs to be said there. Once you have that knowledge that intelligence exists, this form of intelligence, this clustering of cognitive ability exists, and we can make predictions with it, at that point it moves the conversation forward on a bunch of things. If you have a group that's less intelligent, then if you want them to perform similarly, you need to fix that. And then there are all sorts of attempts to fix that. And so from those that succeed and fail, we can see our ability to remediate the problems of low intelligence, or aggregate the benefits of high intelligence, and our ability to do that is very limited. And so all of these practical things that people who are far more brave and far more expansive in their claims than Charles Murray are relying upon, they are all on a very solid foundation. Eternal Fisherman asks, why do people use Discord instead of other platforms? It's a secure voice chat platform and text. So... EgyptoBot says, average person can't comprehend the gradations of intelligence stats. The masses always boil it down to black and white. Nuances don't matter. Yeah, well, the concept of a spectrum is not as what would you say? Is not as easy to grasp as just black and white buckets or groupings. And in fact, such groupings are useful analytically, right? You could group people into high intelligence, medium intelligence, low intelligence. You could do that, and you can make analysis based on that, right? There's nothing stopping you from doing that, and there's nothing that makes that illegitimate. It's just that you have to understand that you're grouping together things that are on a spectrum.
Memorizing and applying a mathematical function, say, and memorizing and carrying out a piano piece, or a dance routine, or a set of football plays.
Oh, right, very cool, right? So this segues into an important point. The dance routine and the football plays right? These are examples of things that are not in that cluster, right? So if you're good at dancing, it doesn't mean that you're good at math, in the same way that being good at math means you're good at chemistry, means you're good at writing, means you're good at all these other things. And means you're good at just means correlation, right? So you have plenty of countries that are very highly represented in terms of their sportsmen who are very, very low intelligence on the average, right? There are no countries that are very highly overrepresented or represented in terms of physicists, which are very low intelligence. That does not exist, whereas that latter thing does exist, okay? There's the G loading of physical activities is much lower is very, very low, right? The high G loaded stuff are the stuff in that cluster. There is still a G loading to every success at everything, because being unhealthy makes your mind work worse and makes your body work worse. So there are things that whack your body and whack your mind. In fact, most things that whack your body real hard will also, to some extent, whack your mind. And so there's going to be a correlation between all things good and intelligence, and that cognitive cluster, right? That's necessary. That is always going to be there. But the cluster itself, the core cluster itself, is made of that association of cognitively straining tasks. So if it's not cognitively straining, right, if it's not in that box of tasks, which people in general would say, oh, wow, yeah, that really exercises your mind, then it's not part of what we're talking about. And people will say, well, who's to say that dance doesn't take its own kind of intelligence? Well, the fact remains that unless you're hamstering or rationalizing in this way, you would not jump up and say, from nothing, oh, dance, obviously that's the most cognitively straining thing imaginable, right? So basically, what he's attacking here is the concept of general intelligence itself. Let's see if I can... Yeah. He's attacking the very validity of G. And yeah, so yeah, predictive validity of G is most conspicuous in the domain of scholastic performance. G is closely linked to the ability to learn novel material and understand concepts and meanings. That latter statement, again, that makes it vague enough that Shaun's attack can start to work. But we don't need to make it that vague. We just need to say that there is this cluster. It exists. This cluster of performance exists, and so something is behind it. We don't need to know what. There's no need to know what whatsoever. There's no need to know what is behind the clustering. We just need to know that there is a cluster to make predictions based on it, right? And so whether the bongo drum player is really very, very intelligent compared to the physicist doesn't matter. It's just not part of the same cluster. Whether you use that word, okay, whether the guy is, okay, well, how is it that the physicist who can't play bongos is better able to learn novel material and understand concepts than the guy who takes to bongos like a fish to water, but doesn't necessarily know math, right? Okay, well, that is confusing, right? There is ambiguity there. You can ride that ambiguity and destroy the concept itself if you take it too seriously. But what we're talking about is not that very vague thing. We're talking about a very concrete thing. In practice, the statistics are based on a very concrete thing, which is this cluster of cognitive performance / scholastic performance, book smarts, so to speak. That clusters. And these clusterings lead to performance differences. Okay? And there's this idea, because we don't have a coherent theory about getting, what would you say, learning novel ability and understanding concepts. We don't have a general theory of learning concepts that make clear to us exactly how and why you have this cluster of like math, physics, chemistry, literature, basically all the things that people would normally say are cognitively straining. We don't have a theoretical reason why, or a clear theoretical reason why it's not the case that those who are good at that are also good at sports, good at playing bongos, good at dancing, good at all that sort of thing. We don't have a clear theoretical underpinning for that difference, but that doesn't mean that the difference doesn't exist. Let's see, where is the video? Davigio. Oh yeah, I see. Here it is. Here it is.
There is a difference. What is it? By what metric are we declaring
Oh hey Josh, good to see you. You can come on Discord anytime, my bud. Glad to see you here.
some of those things to be governed by intelligence and others not? Are there such things as social and emotional intelligence?
Right, exactly. That's outside the cluster. We don't care, right? It's not necessary. It's not part of the G factor. It's not part of what we're calling intelligence. If you want to say, well, how is it that the person who's a physicist, like von Neumann, right? He invented all sorts of techniques. He's an incredible mathematician, incredible physicist, but he liked to stare at women's breasts socially. Okay, it's like, well, how can you say that he's really smarter than the suave, low IQ guy? Well, we're talking about that cluster of things which von Neumann was good at, right? Among many others, right? And this cluster of things, as artificial as it may seem to you, actually turns out to matter. It turns out to matter, right? Regardless of whether you would like it to matter, it in fact is the case that there are people who really can't hack it in terms of math, in terms of physics, in terms of programming, in terms of all sorts of things like that, but can do really well socially or in terms of sports. They exist.
What we might call the ability to read a room, to be aware of the
Right, their ability to read a room. Well, your ability to read a room does not make you a good engineer. They're different capabilities and they cluster, right?
emotions of others and to react appropriately in interactions with them. Is intelligence involved there, or should we just call that something like being sociable? All the various things I just mentioned can be argued to fall under the umbrella of acquiring and applying knowledge and skills, right?
Right, yes, exactly. And that's why that's a very bad definition of intelligence. An incredibly bad definition of intelligence that arises from people who are not acting in terms of pragmatically understanding the world, but are acting in terms of attempting to categorize theoretically what the world is. But if we're talking about making predictions, trying to work and operate in the real world, then until we have an explanatory theory, that sort of preliminary stuff is not very useful to us.
Defining exactly what intelligence is a very difficult thing to do, and there is a wide range of opinions among scientists and academics about the best way to go about it. Following the publication of the bell curve and inspired by the harsh criticism it was...
Yeah, there's a wide range of opinions about how to go about it if you're talking about that theoretical thing. But we don't have anything there. That's shit. It doesn't matter. There's nothing there yet. Maybe there will be, but there's nothing there yet. What we have right now is an empirical understanding of this thing called general intelligence, or just intelligence, which is this clustering of capacities.
Received a public statement entitled Mainstream...
Lanthium last name says, did von Neumann actually stare at women's breasts, or is that just a hypothetical example you came up with? I have heard from Gregory Cochrane that John von Neumann had a penchant for staring at women's breasts awkwardly in social situations. It could be wrong. It's obviously hearsay, but if you've seen videos of the fellow, he doesn't seem very suave. It's believable. Maybe it's wrong, but yeah, it's an example that I have heard.
Science on Intelligence was written by Professor Linda Gottfredson and published in the Wall Street Journal. The statement sets out to outline conclusions regarded as mainstream among researchers on intelligence, in particular on the nature, origins, and practical consequences of individual and group differences in intelligence. The statement was sent to 131 researchers, of whom 52 signed it, many of whom are themselves cited in the bell curve. Important for us here is that mainstream science on intelligence gives the following definition of intelligence. Intelligence is a very general mental capability that, among other things, involves the ability to reason, plan, solve problems, think abstractly, comprehend complex ideas, learn quickly, and learn from experience. It is not merely book learning, a narrow academic skill, or test-taking smarts. Rather, it reflects a broader and deeper capability for comprehending our surroundings, catching on, making sense of things, or figuring out what to do. My favourite part of this definition is among other things, because intelligence is apparently all of this and some other stuff too. My point here is that even among researchers who are cited in the bell curve and would put their name to a defence of its ideas, intelligence is a very broadly defined concept. And even if we can agree on a definition of intelligence...
Right, very, well, not broadly defined in terms of psychometrics, broadly defined in terms of the theory. But the theory is not the issue here. That's not what, I don't know what Charles Murray is talking about, right? Charles Murray says a lot of weird things. So difficult to say. He does put his foot in his mouth with a fair amount of frequency. But in terms of psychometrics, it's not vague at all. It's just that cluster of abilities that tend to go together. That's all. No need to get complicated. No need to know why the cluster exists. Absolutely no need. Just its existence at all is an incredibly powerful fact about the world that lets us categorize people and predict what will happen to them.
intelligence, the second difficult question we have to answer is this: how exactly do we measure it? It's not as simple as testing for some other human abilities. We can measure how fast.
Oh, it is though if it's that cluster. But this is getting repetitious, obviously. If we're talking about that cluster, it's very simple. You just need a test which tends to land in the middle of those abilities. So you have like it's basically you can look at the percentile scores that a person has. If he's 90th percentile in terms of chemistry, 80th percentile in terms of math, 70th percentile in terms of literature, imagining that those are the only categories or the only things that we have data on, then you want a test which puts him at the 80th percentile of that test. And so that's a problem which has been approached by psychometricians and solved. They have a test which tends to land right around the middle of your capabilities. Tend to be around the same percentile on the test as you are in terms of your ability at cognitively loaded tasks. Is this a perfect correlation? Absolutely not. It just tends to be around the middle.
Fast someone is by using units of time and distance, and we can measure how strong someone is by using units of weight. But what do you use to quantify how smart someone is? What we need here is an
Yeah, we just need to engineer a test which lands you in the middle of that cluster.
intelligence.
Most of the time.
We need a way to express someone's intelligence as a number. Now, most people today will recognize IQ as the most common intelligence unit, and let's briefly talk a little about how that came to be. So way back in the old days, if we wanted to determine someone's personality traits and abilities, we could measure their skull, calculate the volume of their brain, or simply look at their facial features. Phrenology, however, has fallen out of favor with scientists of late, although it should be noted the technology sector is currently in the process of reinventing it. Now, I won't be going all that deeply into the history of intelligence testing today, so I'll just start off here by saying that researchers eventually, for the most part anyway, stopped measuring people's skulls and started trying to measure what was going on inside them. The first practical IQ test was invented.
This is an incredibly condescending summary of of the research. Absolutely, like, beyond stupid. But
French psychologist
go on.
Alfred Binet in 1905. This test set out to determine the mental age of school children and was designed with the purpose of identifying those children who were underperforming compared to their peers so they could be given extra help. Such noble beginnings here. Now, Binet, for his part, stressed that intelligence was affected by environmental factors, was not expressible as a singular fixed numerical value, and was not exclusively genetic in origin. His test was designed to identify those who were struggling in school and not to rank people into some sort of eugenic hierarchy. Binet died in 1911 and has since spent the majority of his time spinning in his grave due to everything else we're going to talk about today. An American psychologist called Henry H.
Oh god, what a condescending fuckwit. No. You do not, like, the construct does what it's supposed to do. You can get broader than what it's supposed to be used for, but that's not the construct's fault. And you don't even understand what the construct is. You don't even understand what Stanford Binet was doing, and you dare to say that that you know what he would want or would not want. The test itself, okay, the IQ test is a brilliant way to land right around the middle of your abilities at cognitively loaded tasks or scholastic tasks, or however you want to label that cluster. Okay, that's very useful for making predictions about how a person, a group, a nation is going to proceed, and that's precisely what the test is for. And yes, obviously, we want to use it to help people. Okay, we want to use it to create a better world. Everybody wants to use it to create a better world. Charles Murray wants to use it to create a better world. Your slander of Charles Murray does not mean that Charles Murray is trying to hurt people by talking about intelligence. It's just not true that the malign intent that you ascribe to researchers and people like Charles Murray is actually their intent.
Goddard, translated.
They have exactly the same sort of thing. They want to help people. They want to help people get a better understanding of the world and an understanding of what interventions are going to work or are not going to work, and what predictions we need to make about where the problem spaces are going to be.
Binet's intelligence test into English in 1908 and distributed thousands of copies of the test across the United States. And in 1916, another American psychologist named Lewis Terman, working for the Stanford Graduate School of Education, revised the test into what we know today as the Stanford Binet IQ test. Both Goddard and Terman also worked together with other psychologists to create the Army Alpha and Army Beta tests, which were intelligence tests administered to US military recruits during World War I. Before we go any further, I'd like to pause for a second and propose a question about our intelligence tests here. How do we know that they are actually measuring intelligence? They're called intelligence tests, sure, but that doesn't necessarily mean they are actually measuring intelligence, does it?
Yep. I mean, again, this I could repeat my spiel, but I'm not going to. All of this applies only if you don't understand what they're measuring.
As we discussed earlier, intelligence is a very broad concept. How do we know we're not merely measuring a tiny segment of it?
And the broad concept is fucking useless. It's an attempt to build something much more sophisticated that as yet has not borne fruit and does not matter. It does not matter, right? The attempt to be broad and theoretical is so far useless and is irrelevant to the conversation.
Well, in the early 20th century, English psychologist Charles Spearman used a statistical technique called factor analysis to identify what he called the G factor. Spearman noticed that people's test results across a range of subjects were positively correlated, and reasoned that this was because of an underlying general intelligence factor, which he dubbed G. And this,
or by definition, you could say it's due to an underlying, or by definition, there is an underlying statistical factor. Whether or not, it doesn't matter why, there is that factor, just by the association, it exists.
G factor supposedly underlies all mental performance, so no matter the subject being tested, they are all influenced by this one general intelligence factor. And psychometricians claim that IQ tests measure this G factor, psychometricians being people concerned with psychological measurement there. Now, G answers both of our difficult questions, if you noticed. Thanks to the G factor, the vast range of potential human intelligence is no longer a barrier to us testing for it, because it's supposedly all linked to a single underlying factor that is able to be measured and expressed as a single numerical value. It's very handy, isn't it?
It doesn't need to be linked. Okay, again, it's a statistical association. That means that there is an underlying factor, a scalar that is associated with your performance. Now, obviously, whatever is behind that scalar is hugely multifactorial, because obviously the brain is incredibly complicated, and our mental talents vary tremendously. But it doesn't need to boil down to one thing, or one physical thing, to be a factor behind your success, right? Just like you can take a billion different things, like someone's reach, someone's weight, someone's years of training jiu-jitsu, and try to determine what their fighting prowess is and boil it down to a scalar. There surely is some kind of scalar factor behind people's success or failure in fighting, right? We can make predictions about who's going to win a fight based on a whole range of factors, and it's not a single factor, but we can boil that down to one scalar which describes your prowess, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. And depending on how good a job you do, you'll make better or worse predictions. As it happens, IQ makes fantastic predictions.
This general intelligence factor. Suspiciously handy, one might say, but we'll talk more about G and Spearman's factor analysis later on. Now, before we conclude our little history lesson here, there is something else that must be noted, and it's that early proponents of IQ testing in America and elsewhere were not motivated solely by some neutral scientific curiosity. They were eugenicists. They wanted to use what they could learn from intelligence testing as a way to improve the genetic quality of the human population through what amounts to selective breeding. Henry Goddard, who translated Binet's intelligence test, proposed segregating the so-called feeble-minded into colonies separate from the rest of society. And Lewis Terman, author of the Stanford Binet test, wrote the following in a 1916 work called The Uses of Intelligence Tests. Thus far, intelligence tests have found their chief application in the identification and grading of the feeble-minded. It is safe to predict that in the near future, intelligence tests will bring tens of thousands of these high-grade defectives under the surveillance of society. This will ultimately result in curtailing the reproduction of feeble-mindedness and in the elimination of an enormous amount of crime, pauperism, and industrial inefficiency. End quote. And tens of thousands of...
So here's a question. Should people who have very low IQs get benefits from disability or not? Should we just ignore the fact that they have this incapacity? Because it would be mean. Obviously, in the past, norms were different, okay? But to attribute some sort of absolutely horrendous malice to people who are trying to deal with the reality of incapacitated people, I think it's scummy. I think it's vile.
Americans were forcibly sterilized during the last century, and low IQ test results were used to justify many of those sterilizations. The Eugenic...
And as I've said many times on the Ford show, I am absolutely against any sort of enforced sterilization, right? But that is not the description of people who are interested in this problem, right? Like, anyone who notices a problem can create a bad solution for that problem. That doesn't mean that the problem doesn't exist, right? And so forced sterilization has a very, very bad record in terms of the collateral damage that it causes, the fundamental destruction it does to the proper role of the government in society, all sorts of things, okay? It's a problem. It violates people's rights. It destroys their ability to live happily. In many cases, the record shows pretty clearly that the victims of sterilization were quite miserable. But this is an attempt to solve an existing problem. Denying the existence of the problem is not more kind than coming up with a bad solution for it. Gilbert Salgado says, whatever happened to Soph? Is she gone forever? She went onto freespeech.tv, Gavin McInnes's platform, and her videos are now behind paywall. And I don't really pay for paywalls or use subscription services, broadly speaking, and so I haven't seen her videos. I've just seen excerpts from them, but apparently she's gotten rather JQ obsessed of late.
This movement lost a lot of momentum as a result of the Second World War, during which eugenics became irrevocably associated with many of the worst crimes of Nazi Germany. And in the following decades, many countries distanced themselves from eugenics policies, and many scientists became more suspicious of not just eugenics itself, but also the extent of the worth of intelligence testing as a concept.
Spiritual Mamzer says, if IQ is highly heritable, then why not give welfare? I mean, if you can't help having a low IQ, can you? Well, I think that IQ being highly heritable is a strong argument against welfare. I think that's very obvious. If IQ is heritable, then welfare, or at least welfare as we know it today, which is essentially a subsidy for having children. You don't get welfare unless you have children, pretty much, in America at least. That's a very terrible idea. Now, in terms of some sort of something like universal basic income, I think that is actually justified tremendously by the existence of IQ gaps, and makes a lot of sense. An unconditional income, which does not either produce a barrier towards working more or an inducement to have children, I think that is a very rational response to the realities of intelligence differences being heritable. Oh, what happened? Did my mic go crazy? My mic is going crazy. Let's see. Yeah. Okay, that should work a little bit better.
Now, not to spoil the end of my video here, but this is a good chunk of the reason that the reaction to the bell curve was so harsh. The idea that we can use intelligence test results in order to inform political policy was only half a lifetime before the book was written, getting people sent to gas chambers. So it's not surprising that people would be rather suspicious about it. Let's just say that anyone attempting to resurrect this idea needs to be incredibly aware of and respectful of exactly where what they're proposing can lead. So people are
And what of where your proposal can lead, Shaun? What of where your proposal that this is all pseudoscience can lead, right? If it's real, and you're saying it's not real, then your proposal leads to a vast swath of human carnage that could have been avoided.
fleeing eugenics in droves simply because it was used to justify an indefensible crime against humanity, and scientists are increasingly skeptical of the extent of the usefulness of intelligence testing.
Okay. Science is used to justify atrocious things all the time. Okay? All the signs of heritability has been used in this way, but also other scientific notions have been used, like economic notions, economic theories. Malthus's theories of boom and bust have been used to justify atrocities. That doesn't mean that you dismiss the theories. It means you attack the people who are looking for any excuse at all to commit atrocities. That's the problem here. The problem is the people who are using any excuse at all to commit atrocities, not the theories that they leverage to give credence to their impulses.
And IQ and efforts to rank people according to biology in general. And all this brings us to the bell curve,
Okay. So let's note what Shaun did here, right? He brought up general intelligence and the whole concept, and then he basically launched from just bringing up what it means to this is what Nazis used. And then he moves on to the book. He doesn't address the philosophical considerations that are brought up by the existence of the G factor, right, which highly influence his earlier spiel about, well, what is intelligence really? Well, can we say, right? He doesn't address or really absorb the predictive validity of G. He instead just says, Nazis, now let's go on to the book.
Empire Strikes Back. And in this book, Herrnstein and Murray come to the defense of IQ and say, now, everyone calm down. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater here. Intelligence testing and IQ are important and useful concepts, and crucially, what we can learn from IQ testing should inform our politics and be used to change our society. So, eugenics, but nice this time. And since we've now arrived at the bell curve, I think it's time for us to read it. Not all of it right now, we'd be here all day, but I will briefly summarize it here, for the most part using the introductions that precede each chapter. In the introduction to the book, Herrnstein and Murray begin by talking about intelligence. They offer Spearman's definition of intelligence as a person's capacity for complex mental work, and argue that general intelligence can be measured by IQ tests, saying, furthermore, the classicists point out, the best standardized tests, such as a modern IQ test, do a reasonably good job of measuring IQ. When properly administered, the tests are not measurably biased against socioeconomic
Let's see. No.
Here all day, but I will briefly summarize it here for the most part using the introductions that precede each chapter. In the introduction to the book, Herrnstein and Murray begin by talking about intelligence. They offer Spearman's definition.
Spearman's intelligence was a measure of a person's capacity for complex mental work. And then you get into the thing, well, what is complexity really? Well, a rock is complex, okay? A little piece of rock is almost infinitely complex. We can't simulate even the tiniest piece of it to perfection, okay? Is it complicated? Well, beyond a doubt it's complicated. A single atom is complicated. We can't fully simulate any single atom in this world. Okay, so complexity is not actually a very useful... It's a concept which is badly defined enough that you can use it to create basically insane conclusions. It's like if I were to turn the gain on this camera up enough, everything just becomes white and you can't discern anything anymore. Okay, or the exposure or the ISO or whatever, right? At that point, you've just lost all distinction, and that's what complexity allows you to do. Once you actually embrace the concept of complexity in a hostile context, at that point, everything is gone, because you can say that anything is infinitely complex, and then nothing has distinction anymore at all. So, you know, in a friendly context where everybody knows basically what we mean and we can just agree to take colloquial definitions that are not necessarily nailed down, then yeah, you can talk about complexity. But if you're doing it to a hostile audience, or if you want to be rigid and absolutely well defined and have all your I's dotted and your T's crossed, then bundling a concept like complexity in destroys everything. But yeah, that's a mistake that clearly, but it's a mistake that's ubiquitous, because people don't assume that the people are going to play this trick on them, right? And it is a trick. Well, can't you say anything is complex? And then, well, you can. You actually can say that anything is complex, and there's just kind of a folk notion of complexity that we use, and it seems to work, and it's fine. But it's not something that works in a hostile setting. It's not something that can be justified to a hostile interlocutor. It's just a sense of what things seem like. They seem like they're. It seems like running is less complex than physics or vector calculus or linear algebra or any of those things, right? It seems like running is a less complex activity. It's just what it seems like. Is there a justification for that philosophically and rigorously? No. It just seemed like a simpler activity, right? And I could talk about how strained my mind feels, maybe how whether I can listen to a podcast at the same time as doing something is kind of an indication of how mentally complex it is. I can listen to a podcast while running, no problem. Can I listen to a podcast while learning linear algebra? No. There are things that indicate complexity, and there's a feeling about what is more complex. But is there some sort of rigorous theoretical idea of what is more complex? Well, running is extremely complex. Right? If I had to learn running from first principles, I probably couldn't do it. Right? Like, there's not a chance. I have to use heuristics that are built into me in order to be able to run properly. Right? So it's a pretty complicated activity. Motor control, cybernetic, what do they call it? Cybernetic mechanisms that lead to us being able to be as dexterous as we are. These things are complicated, enormously complicated. But we in a non-hostile setting, we can just talk about complicated or not complicated without jumping into this sort of game.
Definition of intelligence as a person's capacity for complex mental work, and argue that general intelligence can be measured by IQ tests, saying, furthermore, the classicists point out, the best standardized tests, such as a modern IQ test, do a reasonably good job of measuring IQ. When properly administered, the tests are not measurably biased against socioeconomic, ethnic, or racial groups. They predict a wide variety of socially important outcomes. They also defend the practice of IQ testing from critics within the scientific community, notably evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould, whose 1981 book, The Mismeasure of Man, was, quoting the back of my copy here, immediately hailed as a masterwork, the ringing answer to those who would classify people, rank them according to their supposed genetic gifts and limits. In this book, Gould is highly critical of everything from phrenology and craniometry to modern IQ testing.
Right, and Gould's book is, of course, basically fraudulent. Like, its arguments were quite absurd when last I checked. But it's been a while since I reviewed the arguments against Stephen Gould. Overall, my impression of him was that he was quite contemptible.
He argues against the concept of a single general intelligence, and he highlights cases where eugenicists and psychometricians had relied upon bad data and flawed...
Yeah, you can't... General intelligence exists. It's just there. There just is this cluster of capacities, and you could imagine a world where it's very difficult to create a test where that sort of sits in the middle of your performance at a wide range of cognitively loading tasks, or academic tasks, if you like. but in fact that test has been created. So that would be a rather pointless argument, wouldn't it?
Statistical techniques, including the case of Cyril Burt, an early proponent of the use of twin studies for examining the heritability of intelligence, who, after he died, was revealed to have just been making up his research data.
This is what... Right. Again, the twin studies is another favorite bugaboo of these folks. But what they do is they cast totally unsubstantiated doubt on all sorts of very, very simple and straightforward concepts, like the concept of a twin study and the concept of general intelligence, and try to make it more complicated than it is. They try to make it more dubious than it is, and that's just their entire strategy from start to finish. Right? Twin studies are a gold standard for figuring out what is environmental and what is genetic. You take clones, you either separate them or don't. You see what the differences are, how they grow or don't grow. Fraternal twins versus identical twins. You can do all sorts of things, and that's a gold standard way to actually determine the genetic versus environmental causes of variation. But suddenly they become problematized. And yeah, there are problems with everything. You can nitpick literally anything, but this is the gold standard approach, right? And these objections would not be coming out if it was leading to conclusions that they liked. That's why many of these studies were created in the first place, in order to try to bring about those conclusions that people actually want. But sad to say, the estimates of very high genetic contributions are what came out of those studies, right? And it's not the only thing that there is, but over and over again, you see this absolutely misleading approach taken towards these subjects, and just hoping that nobody's going to call them out, hoping that nobody's going to actually chase them on this. They just basically shoot squid ink and then disappear.
One way to do it, I suppose. The bell curve was written with the mismeasure of man in mind, and is in some ways a response to its claims. A newer edition of the mismeasure of man was printed with an extra chapter responding to the claims of the bell curve, and a newer edition of the bell curve was printed with an extra chapter responding in part to Stephen Jay Gould. Gould and Murray probably should have just met up and had a fight at this point. On pages 22 and 23, Hanstein and Murray summarise their main claims about intelligence, which are the following. 1. There is such a thing as a general factor of cognitive ability on which human beings differ. 2. All standardized tests of academic aptitude or achievement measure this general factor to some degree, but IQ tests expressly designed for that purpose measure it most accurately. 3. IQ scores match to a first degree whatever it is that people mean when they use the word intelligent or smart in ordinary language. 4. IQ scores are stable, although not perfectly so, over much of a person's life. 5. Properly administered IQ.
Right, let's look through these. There was such a thing as a general factor of cognitive ability, right? Like definitionally there is. All standardized tests of academic aptitude or achievement measure this general factor to some degree, right? This is just empirical. IQ scores match to a first degree what it is that people mean when they use the word intelligence or smart in ordinary language. True. Yep. Well, to a first degree is doing a lot of work there. Often people will say things like, my dog is smarter than my neighbor. Right? Okay. People could even say things like that means that intelligence can often just mean good. You can often just say intelligent when you mean good. I like it. Right? Oh, he's smart. I like him. They can often be the same thing. He's dumb. I don't like him. Those can often be the same thing as well. He's dumb, I disagree with him. He's smart, I agree with him. Again, could be the same thing. So the folk usage of intelligence is often used in the same way as ugly. He's ugly, I don't like him. His face is horrible, I don't like him, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that the person is objectively, whatever that means, would be rated low. It could just mean because it has a negative connotation that I'm just using it to attack somebody. And that happens with intelligence all the time.
IQ tests are not demonstrably biased against social, economic, ethnic, or racial groups. And 6.
Right, true. Well, by definitionally, like biased would mean that it underestimates their abilities, not that it isn't different for different groups.
Cognitive ability is substantially heritable, apparently no less than 40%.
Yeah.
And no more than 80%. And on that last point, Hanstein and Murray later write in a section titled How Much is IQ a Matter of Genes? For purposes of this discussion, we will adopt a middling estimate of 60% heritability, which by extension means that IQ,
which is a low-end estimate,
is about 40.
Or not. Heritability is, I think, a more complicated issue. Like estimating the genetic contributions versus the environmental contributions. That's where you get really high estimates usually. But in terms of heritability, I think I've seen different definitions of heritability than simply genetic contribution, right? I think that's heritability is usually used not to mean genetic, or not usually. Heritability is very often used to mean just your correlation with your parents, right? Your offspring's correlation with you, as opposed to making a claim about the genetic or environmental reason for that heritability. Right. So this is a potential for trouble here.
80% a matter of environment. So, on to part 1.
Daniel Spurgowitz showed me an interesting video where Luke was saying Judaism was a very practical religion for allowing rape of war captives. Sounds spicy. I never heard that. You need to send me that clip.
Of the bell curve, which is titled The Emergence of a Cognitive Elite, and introduces Bernstein and Murray's theory of the cognitive partitioning of...
By the way, do people want this on double speed, or do they want this slower? I can make it slower if you like. If people prefer.
Of society. Since World War II, they argue,
Might be
colleges
driving
in the
people
United
away.
States have increasingly...
I think Luke is actually playing videos at double speed in order to purify his audience, so to speak. That's my pet suspicion. I don't know that I'm right, but it's my pet theory for why he loves double speed. Although I love double speed as well. I just want to get through things, and I also don't want to. I don't want to freeboot off other people's content. Like I'd rather try to keep it. I'd rather try to keep it an altered thing, even if I'm pausing and responding to it. I'd like it to be altered as well. That just seems convenient. So it's not like a repository of someone else's content in any way, or in any unaltered way. But whatever.
We admitted people by test score rather than things like social standing or familial connections. Where you could once expect to attend a prestigious college if your father had gone there, for instance, increasingly you now need to have competitive test scores. This has led to high IQ people being found disproportionately in the top institutions and geographically close together. The job market is also increasingly IQ focused, as low IQ jobs are replaced by automation, and the best jobs have apparently become more selective of...
This is a very common idea, but as far as I know, not correct. There's not evidence of this, that low IQ jobs are being replaced, but high IQ jobs are not. There's plenty of evidence of high IQ jobs being automated, and the first case of that was the calculators. Calculators used to be people, okay? This will blow your mind. Calculators used to be literally people who were called calculators because that was their job, just to calculate sums or calculate equations. And that job was one of the first to be majorly and drastically automated. And there's no reason to think that automation threatens low IQ people more than high IQ people. In fact, high IQ work is often the most susceptible to automation. Although, by a certain definition, they are more susceptible in the sense that any sort of chaos hurts lower IQ people more, simply because they're in a more precarious situation. Because IQ and wealth correlate, and IQ and income and IQ and all sorts of good outcomes correlate. So people who are low IQ are more precarious, and so they're more hurt by any disruption. But there's no evidence that I've seen that disruption is uniquely in low IQ areas. Far from it.
Of high IQ candidates. IQ is also apparently a very good predictor of job performance. These high IQ people, economically and geographically segregated from the rest of society, are increasingly partnering with each other, and since we're assuming IQ is largely genetic, are producing high IQ offspring. Society is thus stratifying itself into some sort of intelligence-based...
Yeah, this is a theory of Charles Murray that is, as far as I know, wrong, that we're more stratified than we used to be. Cochrane looked at a table of education correlates between men and women, whether women tend to marry people with the same level of education, or more education, or less education. And what they found was there was first of all, people generally marry people with the same level of education. Overwhelmingly, that was the biggest cluster. And then there wasn't much bias either way, and it didn't change very much from many decades ago to now, right? Not that's a measure of hypergamy or a measure of cognitive stratification. And there's this notion that we're way more stratified than we used to be, and again, I haven't seen a convincing argument for that. Or, I've seen many people say it, but we always had stratification, and it's not clear that we're more stratified than we were. At least, not from the data that I've seen. And I'm sure that people will be able to throw studies up, but the fact remains, I've seen tables of the rates at which people marry people of the same level of education, and I've seen them be basically the same from now back to many, many, many decades ago. Okay, so there are lies, damn lies, in statistics. You often want you often want the rawest data possible.
Caste system. At the end of part 1, Bernstein and Murray summarized their claims by saying, 1. The cognitive elite is getting richer in an
And yeah, the idea that this means a caste system, I think, is pretty absurd, because again, we know what caste systems look like. We don't have one, right? Caste systems are incredibly incisive and brutal in stopping almost any cross pollination between castes, right? Like Jews in medieval Europe and the early and earlier on the caste system in India. These were very, very effective restrictions on crossbreeding, and you rarely see such effective restrictions ever. And basically, they don't exist in modernity. There are no examples, I think, of surviving systems which limit gene flow in an endogamous in a population that's the size of a country to such a very, very tiny infinitesimal level that they will remain distinct. Spiritual Mamzer, I'd have to find the post, but it was like a period of several decades.
An era when everyone else is having to
Like 1930s or something, or 1940s? I don't know.
struggles to stay even. 2. The cognitive elite is increasingly segregated physically from everyone else in both the workplace and the neighborhood. And 3. The cognitive elite is increasingly likely to intermarry.
Yeah, this is a claim that I'm not sure about. But I've said what I have to say about that. Again, a lot of dubious claims come out about all sorts of fucking things. But it's not the core issue of general intelligence and whether it can be measured and whether it differs by class or race or any of that.
Part 2 of the bell curve is titled Cognitive Classes and Social Behavior, and here Herrnstein and Murray make the case that intelligence is tied to behavior and predictably determines various things, such as the likelihood of being poor, a criminal, a high school dropout, unemployed, and unwed.
Yep, those are just statistical associations that objectively exist.
Mother, on welfare, and so on. In order to argue this, Herrnstein and Murray first introduced the source of their data, which is the Armed Forces Qualifying Test, or AFQT. This test was taken as part of the 1979 National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. The subjects of this survey were aged 14 to 22 and were administered the Armed Forces Qualifying Test in 1980. Researchers then interviewed the group over the following decade, asking them various questions about themselves. Herrnstein and Murray used the respondents' scores on the AFQT to determine the IQ of each person, and then used their later interview answers to calculate to what degree a high IQ is correlated with positive life outcomes, and to what degree a low IQ is correlated with negative outcomes. Throughout the rest of this section of the bell curve, Herrnstein and Murray go further than simply arguing for the correlation between low IQ and those negative life outcomes. They make the case that one's AFQT score correlates with them more strongly than socioeconomic status does. Herrnstein and Murray compare the AFQT scores of each respondent against their calculation of the socioeconomic status of the respondent's parents. So, as the book Inequality by Design puts it, roughly in the bell curve statistical comparisons, the parent's class represents nurture, and the AFQT score represents nature. Looking at various negative life outcomes, like being in poverty, being in jail, being unemployed, and so on, Herrnstein and Murray repeatedly find that for the young respondents to the survey, AFQT score, and by proxy IQ score, is a more accurate predictor of life outcomes than a parent's socioeconomic status. Herrnstein and Murray conclude this section by stating that a smarter population is more likely to be and more capable of being made into a civil citizenry. Part 3 of the bell curve is titled The National Context and is where things start getting especially controversial. This is the section of the book where they discuss differences in cognitive ability across designated racial groups. They review published literature on differences in racial IQ scores and find substantial.
Hey Josh, sorry you weren't able to come on my stream or Luke's, but it was good to see you around. Have a good night, man.
Differences between the various groups. They discuss the ways in which tests can be biased, culturally and otherwise, but ultimately conclude that these group differences cannot be explained away by bias. In Chapter 15, Herrnstein and Murray talk about how they think cognitive ability in the West is declining.
He just keeps talking about what the book
the West,
is.
Modernization has brought falling birth rates. The rates fall faster for educated women than
Not much to say.
Because education is so closely linked with cognitive ability, this tends to produce a drastically lower IQ people shift in the ability distribution. Furthermore, education leads women to have their babies later, which alone also produces additional dysgenic pressure. Have you ever seen the movie Idiocracy? Because this is just that, basically. Lower IQ people have more.
And incidentally, Idiocracy came from March of the Morons, which was a book based on observations of this data very early on. So, people often make fun of, well, your idea is in Idiocracy, but that idea came from actually scientific literature, by layers of filtration. First, you have the statistical claims, then you have a book written about them, then you have a movie based loosely on the book.
Children than higher IQ people,
Very
so
loosely.
therefore average IQ scores are going down. However, Herrnstein and Murray run into a problem here, which is that IQ scores had been going up, not down, in the decades prior to the publication of the bell curve.
Well, technically wrong. or raw, you would say raw IQ scores. IQ is renormed, right? So the scores can't go up. Well, okay. Raw scores on the test goes up. We renorm the test to be to have a mean of 100 again and again. Yeah, this is the Flynn effect.
This is known as the Flynn effect, named for intelligence researcher James R. Flynn, who documented it, and we will talk more about the bell curve's attempt to account for the Flynn effect later on. Part 4 of the bell curve is titled Living Together and is concerned with social policy. This is where Bernstein and Murray start proposing political solutions to the various problems.
Chinese name says, anyway, China ranked number 1 PISA score is impressive. If you are against China for PISA number one rank, you don't value education nor IQ. Yeah, I don't know. What's your objection exactly?
They outlined in the previous chapter.
Are some people against China being number 1 PISA score? Do they object to that? Is there is there a xenophobic movement going on in PISA?
They discuss and ultimately brand as ineffective all contemporary attempts to help disadvantaged children succeed in life. Things like better nutrition, better schooling, a better home environment, all these things can possibly temporarily make people smarter to a degree, but in the end, Bernstein and Murray conclude that they will all eventually run into a genetic limit that cannot be worked around. Far more money is...
Right. This is just an explanation of what we found, right? Like, including even extreme cases of deprivation that are temporary, like the hunger winter in Finland, I believe. There was an increase in schizophrenia that was marked, but the IQ was similar or no change to IQ in that cohort. So it seems like IQ is pretty stable to environmental insult. Although there are things that we know hurt it, like lead and iodine deficiency and head injury and all sorts of stuff like that. It seems like those are rare enough that someone in a conventionally deprived environment is not substantially altered in terms of their intellect, or in terms of their IQ, regardless of whether you think they're smart or not, or you define it as intelligence or not. Their IQ ranking, their final IQ ranking, not their ranking while they're growing up, tends to be around the same, however they grow up in first world contexts, even rather straining first world contexts, like during World War II.
Spent in ineffective attempts to help the disadvantaged than is spent on the gifted, Bernstein and Murray contend, and we should thus directly shift the resources upwards to support our best and brightest. And this quote is from the introduction to Chapter 18. Some federal funds, now so exclusively focused on the disadvantaged, should be reallocated to programs for the gifted. Affirmative action.
Yep, I mean, it doesn't seem to be doing the disadvantaged very much good, right? If they're not going to hack it, then you should spend that money. You should just give them that money. Fundamentally, you put it in a trust and dole it out to them, year by year, so it'll last their lifetime, and you'll be doing much better for them than to try to get them to excel in an area where they don't seem to have capacities, right? It doesn't make sense to make someone, we don't have an IQ score for fighting, but we have a general sense of who's going to be a good fighter or not, which particularly experts have of potential prospects, and so. If someone comes to a jiu-jitsu gym and says, I want to be the best, but they're not suited for it, they're not going to be strained, they're not going to do the insane thing, which would be to invest in them and risk them to the extent that would be necessary to bring them to their maximum potential in that field. It would be insane. It would be a complete waste of their time and of their safety, because they're not going to make it if they don't have what it takes. And you can just know that. And we don't have like an IQ score for that, but we have other things that we use as estimates of whether someone's going to be able to make it or not.
Action in schools, as it stands, should be scrapped, of course. Bernstein and Murray argue for a sort of race-blind, score-based affirmative action. They still support colleges accepting applicants from disadvantaged backgrounds, but only if they have comparable test scores.
Yep, that would be the rational thing to do. That would actually help those people. Whereas if people are unsuitable, it does not help them, right? It's not a logical way to spend money, given what we know about how human capacities vary.
To the other applicants. Affirmative action in the job market should also be scrapped, with Bernstein and Murray arguing that in pursuit of equality, we have actually already overshot it, and that black people actually attain better quality jobs than white people, once you account for their IQs, of course. Bernstein and Murray argue for encouraging low IQ parents.
Right, and that's a terrible thing. I mean, that what's his face has talked about this. What's his name? Thomas Sowell talked about this. How when he was young, when someone saw a person in his profession, he was a photographer, a black person in his profession, they thought, wow, this must be a really smart black person. But as affirmative action takes its toll, you gradually create a situation where people think, oh, well you're a diversity hire. You really can't hack it here, can you? Based on your race. That's not a kind thing to do to people.
To have fewer
and that doesn't mean that you shouldn't redistribute to them. If you're going to redistribute to them, do it in a way that doesn't impose that kind of contempt, resentment, and anger, frankly, towards that group. You could just give them restitution if that's what you want to do. But you'd be very wise to consider the arguments for UBI in that vein. Universal basic income, it's a universal succor to people who are doing badly. And my argument has always been this universal basic income should be chained to inflation, like inversely. So it should pick up as economic growth slows down, and it should slow down as economic growth picks up. So it's just like it should be another instrument of the Federal Reserve. It's just this UBI number which rises and falls like the interest rate, or in addition to the interest rate, as a way to stimulate or slow down the economy. That would be the thing that makes sense in my view.
Children in a couple of different ways. Firstly, they argue for making marriage a prerequisite for parental rights, and they also support cutting off welfare for low-income mothers, stating that we urge generally that these policies, represented by the extensive network of cash and services for low-income women who have babies, be ended. They also argue more generally in favour of individualism, concluding Chapter 21 by writing, "Individualism is not only America's heritage, it must be its future." Bernstein and Murray conclude this part of the bell curve with the following. Inequality of endowments, including intelligence, is a reality. Trying to pretend that inequality does not really exist has led to disaster. Trying to eradicate inequality would artificially...
True. I mean, so far, he's just stating things, some pretty good analysis out of the bell curve.
Manufactured outcomes has led to disaster. It is time for America to once again try
Is it labeled where the criticism
as life
begins?
is lived, understanding that each human being has strengths
probably
and
not.
weaknesses and so on. This is the end of the main text of the bell curve. Then follows 7 appendices explaining various things about the data and statistical methods used in the book, among other things. Additionally, newer versions of the bell curve contain an afterword written in response to various criticisms directed at the book by various scientists and journalists, and we will be quoting from that at several points later on. So then, that was the bell curve. And before we carry on here, I think it would be worthwhile to attempt to summarize the general argument of the book. So here is my understanding of it in 4 points. 1. General intelligence, or G, exists. General intelligence is to
Great.
some degree heritable, innate, unable to be significantly changed, and unevenly distributed.
And the heritability and the genetic part of it are, again, like the complexity thing, in the hands of a hostile interlocutor can just obliterate the entire conversation. So, to be rigorous, again, it is, if by heritable we mean your parents' performance predicts yours, the heritability is a fact. It can't be debated. It just exists. Okay, that sense of heritability, that exists. If you take low IQ people, they're going to have low IQ children, as long as heritability is as high as it is today. So, for centuries upon centuries, people who were smart had smart babies, people who were dumb had dumb babies. If you think that's going to change tomorrow, then many of the policy restrictions that they talk about don't apply. But if you don't think it's going to change tomorrow, whatever the underlying cause, then their policy prescriptions, their arguments apply.
Distributed both within and across population groups. 2. IQ tests measure G fairly and accurately.
It's just
3.
a fact that
one's
IQ tests
IQ is more
correlate with
important
G.
than one's social background in determining one's life outcomes.
Again, too vague.
And 4. Given what we can learn from these points, we should implement conservative social policies such as limiting welfare, incentivizing marriage, abandoning affirmative action, and more broadly, we should promote a return to a more individualistic society. Now, I'm sure someone could disagree with the conservative adjective in this last point and argue that Bernstein and Murray merely promote whatever policies seem to best address the problem.
Yeah, for sure. This does not imply a conservative conclusions. It could imply a radically, crazy new manifestations of society. Right, like a crazy, breeding pod style, matrix style, house, but that's not, they didn't go in that direction because that's not the direction they're inclined towards, and they'll justify whatever their tendencies are based on the facts as they see them. But yeah, people can take IQ and have taken IQ and ran it in completely different ways.
Problems they discuss. They propose better access to birth control, for instance, which is not typically a conservative policy. Overall, though, their policy recommendations definitely lean heavily to the right. So it's now time to begin looking at the counter-arguments, and we will begin with point 1 on this list and talk about general intelligence. So, if we want to understand general intelligence, we first need to understand the statistical technique by which it is calculated. Factor analysis. They propose better. And if we want to understand factor analysis, we first need to talk about correlation and causation. Starting with correlation, then. Correlation is basically statistical association. Stephen Jay Gould, in The Mismeasure of Man, describes it in the following way. Correlation assesses the tendency of one measure to vary in concert with another. As a child grows, for example, both its arms and legs get longer. This joint tendency to change in the same direction is called a positive correlation. Not all parts of the body display such positive correlation during growth. Teeth, for example, do not grow after they erupt.
Yeah, I suspect this correlation causation thing. You do not need to assume when you're ranking a fighter A+ or S or C or D that skill is just one factor. It's like a skill demon or a skill spirit that lives, or you have midichlorians that are of a certain concentration or not. You can combine a whole bunch of things into a scalar, and whether there is such a scalar or not in some sort of very simple way is not, well, again, is not the issue here. I mean, clearly we have differences in working memory, differences in long-term memory, differences in calculation speed, or number of mistakes, noise, all sorts of things come into the fore when you're talking about how the human intellect works. And so it can't be one thing that you have more of or less of, given what we know about human intelligence already, but it can boil down, it can be combined all into one factor, just ranking you against other people in terms of that cluster of tasks. And that's what we do. We do that, and it works.
Because they share an underlying cause, which is simply general biological growth. However, we can think of plenty of things that are positively correlated and do not share a cause. You might be familiar with the following examples from the page Spurious Correlations, which I will link below. Per capita cheese consumption correlates with number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed.
Right. Okay. This gets a bit complicated. Like, for example, the length of one section of your arm is correlated with the length of the other section of your arm, right? But it's also predictive. It's not spurious. So whether, like, you could cut off this part of the arm and this part of the arm doesn't go away, and you could grow this without growing this. So there's not an inherent causal link where they have to be the same, or they have to be highly correlated. They don't have to be. They're different things, okay? But they are very likely to be, and in the future, they're very likely to be. Like, if you look at, you take a child's length of leg, it'll tell you something about the length of their other limbs, statistically speaking, or definitely the length of other parts of their leg, right? And, that's different from spurious. So whether there is a single underlying cause, which is the same thing, or whether it's going to continue to be predictive if there's like an underlying deeper factor or deeper set of factors, right? These are different questions. So this thing that he's noting, these spurious correlations happen all the time, right? You can always find spurious correlations and then go back and say, well, this was because of this. But in the case of intelligence, we have a very high or general intelligence predictivity of IQ tests. We don't just have retrodictions; we have predictions going back from the beginning of when the tests were created, many decades ago. And so this objection of the spurious correlation here, it is itself spurious. It doesn't relate to the subject here.
Head sheets. Number of letters in winning word of script's national spelling bee correlates with number of people killed by venomous spiders, and so on. Obviously, these things have nothing to do with each other, probably. So some correlations are just chance. It would be an error to assume a shared cause there. Correlation does not imply causation, is the saying. Now, in addition to assuming a shared cause when there is not one, another common mistake here is to ignore a shared cause when...
And by shared cause, we must interpret it to be a very broad thing, as in, they don't have to be inherently causally linked, but rather there is some underlying causation causing both variables to vary at the same time. And again, for predictions that are successful, the chance that it's spurious, that it's just coincidence, is basically zero. Like for decades of successful prediction, as opposed to retrodiction, right? That is not going to be spurious, not going to be random, okay? And again, not only do we have the issue of prediction versus retrodiction, we also have the issue of just our own theory, our own ideas of what seems like it should be causal or not. And to anyone who's really grappled with this subject, it seems very odd or insane to believe that someone's there's no underlying factor behind people's success at various different academic tasks, right? It's like, and the notion that it's just a coincidence that IQ happened to have this high correlation across all these decades, it's just an insane idea. It doesn't make any sense, right? There's no need to invoke coincidence, and it's an insane claim to make.
When there is one. For example, when considering arm and leg length, to ignore the underlying biological growth and assume that legs are getting longer because arms are, or vice versa. There are lots of different ways to misrepresent correlations, basically. I agree with Gould when...
Yeah, there are tons of ways to misrepresent correlations, but that's not what people who say IQ is definitely useful, like beyond a doubt, are saying. Like, and there is no doubt that IQ tests do what they say they do. They line up close to the middle of your scores in terms of your rank at these academic tasks. They do that. It's a fact. They do that, and they have done that for a very long time, right? So that's just a fact about the world. It's not open for debate, whether it boils down to one factor or not. Again, this is attempting to make something that's very simple, very complex, and dubious, where it's just a fact about the world that these correlations exist, and there has to be some kind of mix of underlying causal factors to explain successful prediction over that length of time, right? Doesn't have to be, but it would be astounding if you have that record of successful prediction without some causal link. Some sort of, could be very complex and multifactorial, but there is some causal link.
And he writes, the invalid assumption that correlation implies cause is probably among the 2 or 3 most serious and common errors of human reasoning. Anyway, one result of us calculating the correlation between arm and leg lengths is that we have simplified the data somewhat. The strong correlation between the 2 variables means we can basically express them as 1, so long as we don't mind losing a little information along the way. But what if instead of just 2 variables, we wanted to compare correlations between the size of, say, 50 different body parts? Plotting 2 measurements in a graph is fairly easy. With the addition of a 3rd measurement, though, things start getting a little trickier. This figure from the mismeasure of man, where Gould introduces head measurements into the mix, needs another dimension in order to convey the information. And with more variables added in, the data quickly gets too complex to display with a mere 3 dimensions. And this brings us to factor analysis. Similar to how we simplified arm and...
Yeah, if this was a problem, like if this critique was striking home, you would not have a successful record of prediction, because you'd have just basically what he's describing is like creating spurious correlations based on or spurious models based on retrodicting incorrectly what the causal links were. But if that were the case, you would not have a good predictive result, right? If that's what you're doing, if you were fucking up in this way, you would not have good predictions in the first place.
and leg length to a single dimension, factor analysis can be used to reduce a complex system of correlated variables to a smaller number of underlying factors. And you might find that just a few underlying factors explain the vast majority of the variations in a larger number of variables. And furthermore, you could identify which factor explained the majority of the variation. I won't be going into the...
But what we're doing with IQ is incredibly simple. We just have a cluster, right? We just have a scalar that associates with a cluster of performance in academic tasks, say, right? Where people who are good at one academic task tend to be good at others. That's all. That's all we need. And we can associate that with a scalar. Boom, done. No more complexity needed, right? People do add more complexity. There's all sorts of complexity that you can add to that. And it's not like we end the story there, but that is enough to do everything that Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein need this construct to do.
Exact specifics of how factor analysis works?
Well, that and the heritability, right? That and the heritability. So...
I couldn't if I wanted to be honest, but this is basically how it is used. To quote Gould again, factor analysis is a mathematical technique for reducing a complex system of correlations into fewer dimensions. So you might be wondering, what does all this have to do with intelligence? Well, factor analysis is how psychologist Charles Spearman came up with the concept of the G factor. Spearman looked at a big mass of data showing that people's scores on various intelligence tests were positively correlated, carried out a little factor analysis, and identified the most important underlying statistical factor. He then called this G, or general intelligence. So this G is the underlying general mental ability that we are supposedly measuring with IQ tests. However, there are a few problems with this G factor. One is, as the bell curve itself points out that it's based on statistical analysis rather than direct observation. We are inferring its existence from the data rather than measuring it directly, basically. It is the result of a particular statistical method. Secondly, simplifying the majority of the data down to a single factor can actually obscure a lot of useful information. What if the data shows that people who do well on tests of numerical ability tend to do well on other tests of numerical ability, and people who do well on tests of their language ability tend to do better on other tests of language ability? We can imagine two people who are determined to be statistically as smart as each other, but who excel in completely different areas, right? And there are several different intelligence theories
Right. If this was the dominant paradigm, there would not be this association, right? If the dominant paradigm was one where you have this extremely this lack of general intelligence, but rather a bunch of specific intelligence that are uncorrelated, in that case you just wouldn't have the correlations and the predictions wouldn't succeed. Right, that's all. The predictions wouldn't succeed because you wouldn't have the correlation. But the predictions do succeed because you do have the correlation, and that's all Spearman needs.
identifying different clusters of mental abilities: verbal, logical, spatial, mathematical.
He's making it sound like Spearman boiled it down to one causal, like we have, like, again, midichlorian account, right? Like Spearman said, oh well, I found there's one underlying factor, and that's like one thing, one individual thing, as opposed to a group of things which is behind your success or failure. But he's talking about a scalar, like you have a general factor of intelligence that arises from a cluster of cognitive abilities, and that's all you need. Right? There is some general factor underlying all of this success because of this clustering effect. If there was no clustering, then there would be no such factor.
Or whatever else. You can go and read about all of those if you're very bored. But what can we take away from our little chat about correlation and factor analysis here? Well, first of all, factor analysis tells us nothing about causation. It deals with correlations. It can show that there might be common factors underlying different variables, but it does not identify for us why those variables vary. As a comparison here, let's say you take a sample of 10,000 random members of the public and you test their athletic performance at various physical tests. Amounts of weight lifted, length jumped, speed at running various distances, sit-ups completed, whatever. And let's say that what you find is that people who perform well on one test relative to the group tend to perform well on the other tests relative to the group, and vice versa for those who perform poorly. Now you could, if you so fancied, subject this data to factor analysis. Identify numerically the most important underlying factor and name it F for general fitness or something. And you could probably further assign each person an FQ or fitness quotient. However, what you would not have done is explain why some people are fit.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And Charles, or what's his name? Charles Murray and what's his face? Spearman? What was his name? Richard Spearman? No, I don't know what his name is. Charles Spearman, yeah. Charles and Charles. The Charles duo. Okay. They don't need that. They don't need to have distilled it down to one underlying causal factor of midichlorian count, right? They just need there to be a group of factors which are associated or which some combination of them leads to a scalar capability, right? So one person is, really good in terms of jumping, has really long legs and whatever, and this makes them good in certain ways. They can kick really well, etc. But they fatigue quickly, whereas another person fatigues very slowly but has shorter legs. Okay, right? You could boil them down to the same thing by saying that you have an advantage here, disadvantage here, that cancel out, and based on the numbers, based on weightings, we give them a score, and the score just predicts things, right? And that's what we do with tests. We create tests. We create intelligence tests, which give you a whole array of tasks, and you do well on them or not. And when you do well on them, we tend to predict that you're going to do well at other things as well, right? And that prediction works. It does what it says it does.
Than others. You would have said nothing about the heritability of athletic performance, the degree.
Well, once you've created this FQ, this fitness quotient, you can see how heritable it is as an empirical fact. You can see whether parents' FQs correlate to children's FQs, and I suspect you'd find a relatively high correlation, right? Maybe you wouldn't, but what we have done is test intelligence quotients and their heritability, and the heritability is high.
To which genetics and environment contribute to athletic performance, you'd have said nothing about the...
And the genetics and environment thing is, again, this is unnecessary complexity for the moment, right? Whether it's due to upbringing, that it just happens to correlate with your genetic heritage, even if you're separated at birth from your identical twin, it still correlates with your heritage. Well, such thing can be imagined, but the question is, what predictions do you make?
Causes of the data at all. It would be a leap of logic to assume that each person's FQ is innate and unchangeable. The data you have cannot tell you any such thing.
No, what tells you whether it's changeable is your attempts to change it, right? So how changeable the FQ is depends on how well your efforts to change it goes. And so no one took from IQ that it was unchangeable, but their attempts to change it didn't work, right? And that doesn't mean that IQ doesn't change. IQ changes all the time. IQ changes constantly at all times, okay? That's not the problem. Like, just like health changes constantly at all times. So you get better spontaneously all the time. People have cancer, they get cured spontaneously of cancer all the fucking time. It happens all the time, you know? But the question is, can you cause it to happen more than it naturally does through intervention? That's a control group and an intervention group. That's science, okay? So we had quack medicine. You're sick. You take quack medicine, you get better. That happens all the time. That happens most of the time. You're sick, you take quack medicine, you get better. Most of the time you get better because naturally you just tend to get better, or you die, right? But most of the time you don't die. Most problems tend to go away on their own, right? Yes, most problems tend to go away on their own, or at least they tend to wax and wane in their severity. And so if you take medicine, and whether it's quack medicine or not, and you tend to if you're on a low point, to get higher, or you die, right? But the real test is not whether your patients get better, but whether they get better at a higher rate than control. That's the importance of control groups. That's why control groups were so important. That's why it's so valuable to have a control group and an intervention group, because just they got better is not really relevant, right? Can we change FQ, right, for athletes? Well, there's a high likelihood that if we're talking about people who are already serious athletes, right, there's a good chance that we can take a bunch of different factors, distill them down, call them a fitness quotient, and see whether they can be changed or not. See whether someone with like very short arms and very low oxygen efficiency can become a super MMA fighter. But the answer is probably not. Once we're getting down rigorously enough to the different factors behind the success or failure of MMA fighters.
By itself. You may also find that your singular numerical fitness quotient obscures a lot of useful information.
It might obscure or it might create useful information. It can also create useful information. So if we have this FQ and we find that it predicts your success really, really well, and it's not very changeable, then it means that, say, gyms that have really good fighters, let's say it predicts your ability to fight in MMA rings, right? It would mean that gyms that produce good MMA fighters primarily do it by selecting winners as opposed to creating winners, right? That would be useful. That would be a useful thing to do. And, there's no reason not to do it. Like, if this was a matter of incredible societal importance, it probably would be done.
For instance, you might find people who are better at strength exercises tend to be better at other strength exercises, and so on.
Would be shocking if it wasn't the case.
The existence of a general factor of cognitive ability would not explain why there are differences between people.
No, and we don't have that explanation for the brain, really. We have correlations. We know that it has to have something to do with brain size, because brain size correlates with intelligence to a moderate extent, and it would be insane, it would be crazy if brain size and intelligence didn't correlate, because there has to be some way to pay for the caloric expenditure here. It has to make itself pay. So if people who had bigger brains were not actually smarter, it's like, well, how does it pay else, right? How else does it pay? Does it cool the blood? Okay? There's not a lot of things that this very expensive organ could be doing, and so it would be shocking if there was no correlation between bigger muscles and strength or bigger brains and intelligence, right? There's also other things that have been theorized, but we don't have a way to just scan someone's brain and tell us how intelligent they are. We don't have enough knowledge to do that yet. We likely eventually will. Right? It's likely that we eventually will be able to look at someone's genome, look at someone's brain, and make a very good prediction about how smart they are. Right now we can't.
In fact, the G factor is perfectly consistent with a 100% environmental approach to understanding intelligence. We could play devil's advocate here and say, yes, a general factor of intelligence exists, and...
Devil's advocate. Jesus Christ, dude. Like, again, this is what they do. They just cast doubt on facts. They just go, well, it's very dubious, it's very racist, and we don't like it. And then, they don't actually address the fucking issue. Like, it doesn't matter whether you like the G factor or not. You don't have to play devil's advocate in order to believe in the G factor. It's just a fact about statistical associations between tasks, between successive tasks.
It is important, but the variance in G between people is explained entirely by environmental factors.
Yeah, you can say that, right? That's not... the G factor itself does not inherently do that work of saying whether it's environmental or genetic. right? No one says that. What does the work of defining whether it's environmental or genetic are experiments where you vary environment while keeping genes constant and vary genes while keeping environment constant, right? And then there's always, as with any experiment, the question of how constant you've kept things on one side versus the other, and how much how properly you've varied one side or the other. But in terms of our attempts to do that, which always have flaws, those attempts tend to give us the result very high genetic role. That's what does that, not the existence of G itself.
Childhood nutrition, socioeconomic status, school quality, and so on. Absolute.
Again, yeah, but it's been tested, dude. Like, we have the Hunger Winter cohort of fucking Finns, right? And we can see whether they're retards or not. And they're not retards. They're just as smart. They're crazy. They have like, I think, twice the incidence of schizophrenia or something like that. But they're not retarded. They don't get dumb. The people marching out of the death camps in the Holocaust were not dumb, right? The Chinese in Malaysia were not dumb. The Jews of old Europe were not dumb. Like, Jews in ghettos were not dumb, okay? We have experiments going back a long way, natural experiments, and then actual experiments where we vary one, keep the other constant, vary the other, keep the one, keep the first thing constant, and we can see evidence of an incredibly high importance of genetics or some other heritable factor, which has to be sticky. Okay, it has to be sticky. It has to be like people have used the term deep culture. Okay, maybe it's deep culture, but it has to be really, really, really deep, and it has to be really hard to change. It has to stick to the next generation, even if they completely change their living circumstances, even if they give their children away for adoption. Even then, it still sticks. Okay, such things can be imagined, but the more rigorously you define this very sticky culture thing, the more it becomes just practically the same as genetics. Why do you think you can change this deep culture? Your attempts at changing culture in much, much shallower ways don't work either, right? So, and genes, maybe someday soon we'll come up with effective genetic alteration interventions, right? Could happen, right? They're both in the category of things that could happen, but probably won't, given that over centuries of hammering away at this problem of like how to make people smart, we haven't made a lot of progress.
Nothing happens in the factor analysis process to tell us about what the causes are for people having different measurable levels of intelligence. And even if we accept a single general intelligence factor exists, that would not necessarily imply a genetic causation. And speaking of genetics, let's next talk about...
No, of course it would. Of course, how could it? How could it? It's like, oh, well, it's just the existence of the fucking thing, of the construct. It doesn't tell you what causes it. What tells you what causes it is the experiments. Which I don't think that does the bell curve address twin studies? Maybe it does. But I think that they tend to take a very, very conservative view on the genetic thing. But yeah, we don't derive from the construct that it does all that work for us. The construct lets us make these experiments, lets us observe these things, and lets us defend the notion that intelligence can be just called this thing that we think is intelligence, right? It does work. It gives us predictions, okay? So this notion that oh, well, we can't define intelligence is a rock star? Doesn't that take a kind of genius? All that sort of shit? That's shit. We can just say, well, fuck you. We have a construct here. It makes predictions, and these predictions work in terms of whether your country is going to be a shithole or not. Okay, whether you're going to make good roads or not, whether you're going to make good anything or not. Right? It's a prediction that carries water for all sorts of things that we would think smart people would be better at. So that's what it does for us. But it doesn't on its own define all these things.
The word heritability. When the bell curve says cognitive ability is substantially heritable, apparently no less than 40% and no more than 80%, what does that mean exactly? If we average it for 60% like they do, are we therefore to assume that each person's individual IQ is 60% determined by heritable genetics and
is this video just going to be asking these fucking questions?
40% by
what does it mean? What does it all mean?
Well, no. Heritability is unfortunately one of those awkward words which has a common use understanding and a scientific understanding which differ in a few important ways.
The common use understanding is something like the ability of a thing to be passed down genetically, right? You can
Well, I've seen both. I've seen like both definitions used in either a colloquial or a scientific context.
inherit being tall or having red hair, but you can't inherit a scar or a finger lost in an accident, say. The technical academic meaning of heritability is rather different. Heritability is a numerical concept used to estimate the contribution of genetic variance to overall variance
That's another definition, but I have heard
of a trait within a group. So basically,
that's how they're using it in the book, but I've heard it used to describe just correlation between offspring and parent, regardless of the causational links there, regardless of how it happens through genetics or through a common environment. The heritability can be just the correlation between the prediction that you make about the offspring based on the parents. How strong a prediction can you make about the offspring's traits based on just your knowledge of the parents' traits, regardless of what the causation is behind it.
heritability estimates the degree to which the variance of a trait within a group is due to genetics. Height is thus a heritable trait. Taller parents will generally have taller offspring, for example, and this is measurable against a population group. Having 2 arms, however, is not a heritable trait, because almost everyone has 2 arms, and for people who don't have 2 arms, that variance is usually environmental in nature. Having 2 arms is genetically determined, but it is not a
Is being circumcised heritable? I mean, there's definitely a correlation between your parents being circumcised and you being circumcised, right? So if we're being agnostic about the reasons for the differences, let's see, where is that heritability? Yeah. Parent, offspring, yeah. Uh-huh. Right. Yeah, I mean, that's what I've seen. It's just people talking about this estimate, just the parent-offspring correlation or regression, and using that as heritability. And then you'll find that usually you get very high. Like these problems usually don't manifest in terms of like things that are spuriously heritable, and so yeah, like. But I have definitely seen the usage of this term where they're just talking about the correlation between and your predictions based on offspring parents, and not necessarily saying that it has to be genetic. But yeah, obviously when I look at it on Google, I just find the genetic definition. But in any case, it's weightless. The point is, there is this idea of parent-offspring correlation, which can be high or low, and does not depend on it being genetic. Although it universally, pretty much, and I've never seen a case where the parent-offspring, concordance is very high for a trait, for an important trait, where there's not where that's not genetic, right? I mean, I'm sure it exists, but I haven't seen it.
heritable trait, if you follow, because genes account for very little of.
Like we can create theoretical ideas, like heritability of blindness in areas with high rates of certain like eye worms and stuff, right? That's definitely going to be a correlation between your parents' likelihood and your likelihood to have it. But it's not genetic because it's due to that worm, right? What is it, trichinosis or something like that? There's some sort of river parasite that blinds people. But yeah, before you know whether it's genetic or not, you can do the math on the correlation, and you can make predictions with it.
The variance within the population group. Something that is very highly heritable, we would say has a heritability of 1. Something that is not heritable at all, we would say has a heritability of 0. If we say something has a heritability of 0.6, then what we mean there is that 60% of the variance of the trait in a population group will be due to genetic factors. What it does not mean is that 60% of the trait in one individual is due to their genes and 40% due to the environment. Heritability tells us about variance within a group, not the makeup of individuals. It is a population statistic. You cannot meaningfully ask what the heritability of your IQ is. So where am I going with this? Well, there's a couple of points that I'd like to...
You can definitely ask meaningfully what the genetic contribution is to your IQ versus the environmental contribution, right? So you can ask whether you're dumb because your parents have dumb genes or whether you're dumb because you got hit in the head really hard with a baseball bat. You can ask those questions. They're valid scientific questions.
Make. The first is that a trait can be determined by your genes and be very lowly heritable, such as the presence of arms, and also the inverse of that. A trait could be very highly heritable and not directly genetically determined. One common example used to illustrate this is earrings. What would we say accounts for the variance in whether people wear earrings?
What's that correlation, though?
Within a particular...
Whether it's genetic or not, you can do the math on
Mikey,
the...
you're hot micing. Oh, let's see. I'm not hot micing. Let me see. My audio is not going through Discord. Let's see. Voice and video. We're going to use the microphone array. Yeah. Okay. Nope, that didn't work. Yeah, Mike, if you're listening to the stream, you can talk whenever you like, and I'll hear you immediately, but I'm going to try to get my voice working. Input device, yes. Don't push to talk. Okay, okay. Okay, right, there we go. Yeah, okay, now I'll just hot mic myself. Okay, so now you can hear me on Discord, I hope, Mike, and you can comment whenever you like. Let me know.
So, Kyle,
yeah, go ahead.
What's new? How you doing, man?
Hey, pretty good, man. Glad to see someone finally take the plunge and hop on Discord. I'm going to turn the Discord window on. Yeah, things have been going pretty well. The Luke show has been pretty quiet lately. Not a lot of blood sports, not a lot of drama. I think
yeah, how
Luke is trying to have a more highbrow
how do you feel about
sensibility.
It's interesting as far as news goes, but I was just watching some of the old streams that are pretty interesting, like the history of the Luke Ford show, and pretty funny.
Yeah, like
Kinda
definitely
watching...
the broad appeal of the show has gone down when there isn't as much conflict. But I try to get people on. You know, I try to get Josh on, tried to get Babs on. It's just yeah, the guests. We need more variety in guests, I think. But I mean, depending on what the goal is, Luke has said that he's not necessarily looking for a meteoric rise in viewership.
I think kind of the random discussion in the old days was good. Maybe the show's missing a little bit of that. I call in every now and then, but I don't have as much of an opinion about the news as like Kevin does, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It just has to be something specific.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's a difficulty. I should probably get off my ass more and try to network more, both for my show and for Luke's. Get more guests and stuff. That's really the only way to get big. But you know, I'm kind of longing for the old days when the drama would come to you. You know, you wouldn't have to go out and fish for drama. Although, yeah, I mean, in a way, it's fun. I say that I miss it, but there's like way less conflict on the show. It's way better for my adrenaline than it was.
Yeah, but you don't have any challenges. All the people went away. But
Yep.
if you watch those old shows, there's so many random people that would trickle in.
Yeah, I think Zoom is less amenable to that than Hangouts, and also yeah, a lot of it was, I think, the early show shaking out, like Luke figuring out what his regulations wanted to be, you know, all that sort of thing. When there's a much larger group of people, it's impossible to regulate it too much, and so it becomes more of like a natural, free-flowing thing. But that's pretty much, that era has kind of ended.
Yeah, and then that falling out that happened, basically, I think that was inevitable one way or another. Because you're dealing with people that are, I would call them deranged or deluded, that all these crazy ideas and they just can't let go of. So it's like...
Well, the crazy ideas are one thing. Like, what's his face? Rodney Martin has some ideas that, in my opinion, are crazy, but he's perfectly capable of holding down a conversation, and I find him a very valuable individual to talk with, even though I don't like his views. And that applies to a lot of people. I think that OV can be a really good conversationalist, and I deplore his views, but he can still be someone who you can talk to. But these people, they were just they were astonishingly vitriolic, and that really, like, it shows in their fights that they have with each other and with their idols. Frankly, like, they're just high conflict people. There's just conflict wherever they go.
They would attack you personally. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Those two and what's his name? The guy from Oklahoma. Fuck. BR or what? He's got a bunch of different names. I mean, he was kind of nutty like that too. Go shine your passport, Kyle. Crazy.
Yeah. Well, there was Melchizedek, there was Brundlefly, and there was Matvey. Basically, were the three, and they were all at a certain point they all became extremely hostile, and basically forced a situation where it had to be like one of these factions was going to push the other out ultimately, and that's what came to pass. They brought that battle, right? I was actually initially quite conciliatory, even after a lot of insults, but they just kept on coming. That's just the way that they were.
Yep, it's all history now.
And of course, I'm not the most what would you say, amicable. I'm not the most amicable dude when it comes to insults. So, yeah.
You're pretty combative.
Yeah.
Well, people like it.
Right. Yeah. The unfortunate thing is that there really wasn't. Yeah. Well, unfortunate after a fashion was just that the dynamic was not sustainable. It turned out to be a fairly thin bench of people who are ready to come on. But I think that's common in relatively small streams, is that you're not going to have like a huge number of what would you call irreducible people to come on, like an endless flow of people, like the huge streams do. Anyway, Conops, good to see you.
Yeah, definitely.
Conops and Mike remind me of the old days. Anyway, do you guys have any thoughts on the video so far, or on the subject of the bell curve? Or Shaun himself?
Not really. I hadn't listened too closely, but just wanted to come on and say hi real quick.
Hey, nice to see you, man. Yeah, we need to do some more streams. I need to figure out some more guests at the end of the day. But yeah, Conops, are you there? I'll keep watching the video. You guys can follow along or not.
Group. Well, depending on the group, most of the variants could be due, in one sense, to a genetic factor, biological sex. Wearing earrings would therefore be a heritable trait, but this does not mean that there is an earring gene that is being passed down generationally.
Right.
The
Yeah,
majority
exactly.
of people wearing earrings being women would be due to environmental factors, fashion and gender roles, which are subject to change over time.
Kyle, can you hear me or not?
Now I can hear you.
Ah, finally. What's up, man?
Hey, how's it going? Good to see you. Been a while. Haven't been streaming for a while. So, glad that on my first stream back I could get some people. How have the arguments been, Conops? Have you been fighting it out on the Claire Caw stream or not?
Yeah, I just released two videos about Claire Caw, but it turns out she's not the only one with similar ideas. It turns out that Luke had a little hot mic moment as well.
Oh, what happened?
Well, basically, I was on Daniel Stinkovich channel, and he showed me a stream where where Luke Ford was listening to some ISIS victim, and he's saying, well, like in Judaism, you can only rape her once, and then you have to wait a month, and then you can either marry her or not. Judaism is very practical religion. That's what he said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like something earlier Luke might have said. How long ago was it that he said this? Sounds like the new TOS concerned Luke probably wouldn't. Yeah, I don't know. Anyone who's approaching these subjects will end up covering themselves in some sort of infamy, I guess.
I don't know.
Um,
I don't know. 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 I don't know Well,
Yeah.
he likes it, but it surprised me a bit. I thought like Luke would not go there, but apparently I'm
Well,
wrong.
today's Luke wouldn't. I don't think that
But
today's Luke.
today's Luke is a censored Luke.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So
That's too bad. So we don't know how he feels now.
I think we know how Luke feels. You can just watch older videos and also get a sense of just reading between the lines, and you can see what Luke thinks about things. I don't think he's I don't think he's very opaque, right? And I think that what I think as well, right? I'm subject to censorship as well, but you can get a sense of someone's ideas if they're not trying to conceal them. And Luke, I don't believe that Luke is trying to conceal anything. He's just basically trying to stay within terms of service and stay what would you say? Stay within terms of service. Avoid the ire of activists and stuff like that to an extent. But he doesn't. I don't think he lies, or I don't think that he. I don't believe that Luke would advocate something seriously that he doesn't actually believe in.
Well, I mean, at some point you have to compromise, right? I mean, at some point you compromise truth. If you censor yourself, even for the guidelines, right? I mean, people don't really know what you're thinking anymore. I mean, it's not always possible to read between the lines.
Yeah.
Especially with statements like that.
Well, sure. You're always sacrificing a certain amount of legibility, but that is distinct in my view from an intent to deceive. But it's very complicated. It's like I don't know if you heard earlier on the stream how the issue of complexity could be in the hands of a hostile interlocutor used to basically define everything as complex or not complex as they see fit. Same with honesty, I think, or implied honesty when you're talking about people who are not being direct but are being indirect. You can always call that dishonest, and I can't disprove it. I can just give you my sense of it. So I don't think that Luke is dishonestly I think that Luke's unstraightforwardness is straightforward. That's just my sense of it.
But I mean, you know how white nationalists draw people in, right? They never show what they really think until you're already in. Right? And the same applies.
Well,
to
no,
movement.
not exactly. I don't think that that's actually how white nationalists operate, especially in the modern day. But they definitely are deceptive. Like they will outright lie, and lie not merely to survive, but also to maneuver. They will lie to derange, and I don't believe that Luke lies to derange or to mislead. I think that he, if he has to lie, he lies to survive, and those are distinctions, or not survive, but you know what I mean. He lies to avoid. To avoid dishonest attacks, or not. He lies to avoid censorship, stuff like that.
But don't you think that the censorship? Do you think it's only the guidelines that he's concerned about, or do you think it's also something in him that he doesn't want to necessarily touch all these very controversial topics anymore, and doesn't want to invite people because he used to really invite people. And then everybody knew, like, oh, right, this is gonna have some problem with the terms and conditions.
Yeah,
and he was fine with it.
Well, a number of things happened. He got restricted on his channel. Like the what would you say? The fragility of the entire YouTube thing was made clear to him. The shootings happened. The shootings of synagogues and of houses of worship happened, and that changed his perspective and his opinion on these groups. But even earlier than that, just the very destructive and criminal behaviors basically disillusioned him, and so he's been sort of drifting away from that. Although he seems to like the Groypers. He has an extreme aversion to any, I think, Spencerite group at this point.
What do you think about the Groypers, Kyle?
I despise
You're
them.
not that enthusiastic, right?
Yeah, I think that they're scum. I really dislike the way that they pretend to be America first while basically decrying American values down to the founding, and not just American values, but American actions. They're the type of people who get really angry about references to the U.S. victory in World War II. They say, oh well, that was a terrible war, an awful war, but when they talk about Jews, suddenly there's no objection to brutality there, right? So that I think shows where their loyalties lie, at least the loyalties of their leaders.
Oh, was that Mike?
Mike,
All right,
if you yeah, pause the stream. You don't want to listen to the stream.
I can't let you slander the Groypers, Kyle.
Oh, yeah. You wanna defend the Groypers?
Oh no! I'm not defending the Groypers.
No. He was talking to me.
Oh, Mike.
Yeah. Do we sound that similar? Me and Mike?
Both alpha, so we sound alike.
Yeah. All alphas sound the same.
It'd be interesting if that event actually happens.
The Groypening?
If you've heard about it.
Yeah, I've heard about it. I think,
yeah.
Wasn't the location and date unspecified? Maybe it got specified.
No, I thought it was South Florida. It's supposed to be simultaneous with not CPAC, but TPUSA or something like that. South Florida on the 20th or something like that.
Yeah.
So that would be a potential clusterfuck if it happens. So
I don't know. Yeah, their own events seem like they're like universally lame, right? When these people try to run their own event as opposed to gate crash other people's events. So yeah, I wouldn't have high hopes about that. Basically, all the sparks seem to fly when they fucking try to take over another person's event. But people are getting wise to their tricks, right? Like fundamentally, they're very like the caricatures that they lay out against their enemies, and that they're kind of this one-trick pony of lies that once countered just kind of fizzles out. So yeah.
But don't you think, Kyle, that the conservatives, especially the so-called free speech conservatives, are uniquely vulnerable to their attacks, because they always said, well, we are in favor of free speech, and we should have all open debate, and everybody should be included. And then you have these guys that they clearly don't want to have included.
I don't think so, because, like, for example, TPUSA put them in the front of the line, and Charlie Kirk has addressed their questions over and over again, right? And Dan Crenshaw addresses their questions. They don't refrain from addressing them. They actually address them head on. And so, by no means can free speech be stretched to the notion that people have to agree with you. Right, it can be stretched, and I think with a certain justification, to the notion that Q&As for Congress people and for political movements should be open to dissenters to an extent. Like there should be a certain amount of accountability there, but you don't have an obligation to agree with the questioner. That would be just absurd. So yeah, like TPUSA is very free speech, gives them the opportunity to come to the front of the line, and like there was a whole line of Groypers, and Charlie Kirk addressed it again and again in the most recent event, I believe. So yeah, they're giving them free speech. They're just disagreeing with them.
I didn't know that. I thought that Nick Fuentes was actually kicked out of an event.
Oh, Nick Fuentes was not allowed into a conservative, I think a CPAC event or something like that. Yeah, but his followers were like were in that event, like that TPUSA event. Like TPUSA has a policy where people who disagree come to the front of the line, and his followers were there and came to the front of the line and asked questions. Whether Nick Fuentes himself is allowed in, I'm not sure whether that was TPUSA's call or not. But I don't think that you have an obligation to let any individual in, but you do have maybe an obligation to listen to the dissent of groups of people or of individuals who come to question you. I don't believe that Nick Fuentes is like Nick Fuentes' followers could be excluded a lot more easily if that was the goal.
I mean, they're just trying to use TPUSA as a platform to get attention.
Whatever happens, like
more followers.
Yeah. Anything but the red carpet being rolled out for them is going to be called not free speech, because that's their entire propaganda ploy, con ops, right? It's to say, well, these free speech conservatives are not really free speech at all. But what's actually happened is that free speech conservatives have embraced free speech and answer their critiques openly whenever they come. So, yeah, I mean
maybe they don't like the answers. Probably.
Yeah, they don't like the answers, right? and they don't like. Oh, another thing they don't like is like how they're the like what's her face, Ashley St. Clair or someone like that was photographed with Nick Fuentes and then was kicked out of the organization for fraternizing with Nick Fuentes. That's the sort of thing that they argue is not free speech. So yeah, but you know, that's an incredibly expansive definition of free speech to say that you have to keep someone in your organization if you don't agree with their associations. That's not, and it actually goes against like the ideas that supposedly these people are leveraging to say that today's society is oppressive by not allowing them freedom of association. So yeah, very, very shallow.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about all the anti-Israel stuff, but I think the demographic issue in the United States is going to be a major issue, and is a major issue for people on the right. So if you hear Charlie Kirk and just pretending like these things don't matter so much, I'm not sure if that will go well with a bigger audience.
Well, Charlie Kirk is an immigration restrictionist, right? He's saying we don't want more immigration, and what immigration we have should be of like wealthy, well-to-do people or people with very valuable skills, stuff like that. He advocates building the wall. Like, there's not much you can do beyond build the wall, restrict legal immigration and illegal immigration. That's what you can do, right? If you want to move beyond that, you're kind of I don't think that there's a future for that in American politics of like trying to deport citizens. It's fundamentally un-American. It goes against the ethos of America from the very beginning of this country, where it was not an ethno-state, where they did not say only English people or stuff like that. They could have said that, but they didn't say that, right?
But you had major periods in American history where people were either deported or were not allowed to come in. Look at the Chinese Exclusion Act, for example. I mean,
right, yeah, but
there are moments.
it makes sense not to allow people to come in who will change the character of the nation for the worse, and that's what Charlie Kirk advocates. He already advocates an extreme extractionist position, but that's not enough for them because they're not honest about what they object to. They don't object to the politics. What they're trying to do is to hijack conservatism and turn it against minorities in the sense of trying to disenfranchise them or otherwise disempower them. But that game is not going to work.
Well, I don't entirely disagree, but I think Nick Fuentes has found more viable strategies. It's the same strategy that Luke uses in a way. I mean, Fuentes is not very honest about how he truly feels about things. And I think that will draw more people in than, for example, somebody like Richard Spencer.
Well, Fuentes is I don't think that Fuentes is actually dishonest in the manner that you're trying to say, maybe. Like, I think he's very clear about his antipathy towards Jews. And he makes that clear in like a whole range of ways. He will lie about his opinion about all sorts of things, right? He will lie in order to maintain his place on platforms, and he will lie in order to attack his opponents. Like that's where the distinction comes in, where Fuentes says, "Well, I'm a Latino campus conservative, and all these crazy white nationalists have nothing to do with me." So he will lie to derange. He will lie to the extent of pretending to be something entirely different than he is, but he will also tell, but he never lies about being okay with Jews, as far as I've seen, right? He never goes, well, Jews are great.
He's watered it down considerably in the last, I would say, half year or so. He doesn't talk about the Holocaust.
No, he doesn't talk about. Yeah, he doesn't talk about the Holocaust. But I mean, when he talks about things, he talks in a very thinly veiled way about how Jews are a problem. Right, and that's his genuine perspective.
But more general, like the hard cutting issues. For example, saying, he used to say, like, well, I don't believe that figure, and now he will say, yes, a lot of people died on sites, and Jews were not the only people who died, for example. So he's changing his rhetoric to draw more people in. I don't know if he's actually changing his views, but I would say this moderation will bring more people in, because I think there's even a lot of people that initially were quite enthusiastic about this whole alt-right thing, but really got turned off by, how would you say, the white nationalism 1.0 that was rather prevalent.
Sure, I think Nick Fuentes will have a lot of success in sweeping up people who were disillusioned with the alt-right. but I don't think he'll have a lot of success in making inroads to conservatism or conservatism more broadly, like especially institutional conservatism. I think he's going to fail miserably in his attempts there.
Yeah, I
I
think
agree with
modern
that.
conservatism in the United States, in particular, doesn't have a lot of answers to questions about society.
I think it does. I think it has really excellent answers, actually. But where do you think it falls short?
Well, about community and society, I think it's a lot about economics. It's a lot about looking through metrics like GDP and not looking through metrics like welfare, well-being, society, community,
Do
and
you think
other
that
things
that, that
were.
characterizes the conservatives more than the liberals?
Yeah, I would say so. Like, look at somebody like Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher famously said, "There's no such thing as society."
Yeah, I mean, whatever. Look, I think that the conservatives are probably less apt than the liberals to be economic reductionists. I think that they actually are more focused on things like societal stability, conservative values, sexual mores, relationship norms, stuff like that, religious religious norms, all that stuff. They're way more concerned about that than the left seems to be.
Well,
And-
but there's still some big issue and tension between what
And a lot of
religious
their-
conservatives always thought of and the fear that that how would you say more libertarian conservatives have against the state.
Well,
I think there's a big tension here, and since the paleo conservatives were basically kicked out of the movement or marginalized to a very big extent, I don't think that voice is there in the conservative movement anymore.
yeah, I don't think the paleocons were very useful. And I guess I'm still waiting for like where conservatives are inadequate. You've mentioned conflicts within the right, and there definitely are conflicts within the right, but I don't think that that's evidence of conservatives or of some sort of inadequacy on the part of the American conservative movement.
Well, I think the inadequacies you can see pretty much everywhere. It's the neoliberal project that conservatives worked for very enthusiastically.
Would you call the neoliberal project a failure?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, I think it's a big failure.
Relative to what? Like, what do you expect to have like way
Relative
better
to
results?
what we had before, I would say more social democracy and Christian democracy. Yeah.
I don't think. I think that's. I don't like social democracy, for the record. So.
Yeah, I know you don't.
I mean, and I think that what you call neoliberalism has a better record than social democracy, but that's a difference.
Well,
of
I
opinion
don't
there.
think so. I don't think so. I think that the whole public sector has been there's basically almost no investment in the public sector for a long time. People's quality of life, especially in the lower to lower middle classes, has significantly deteriorated. Even to
I
the
disagree.
point that
I think that's
some
entirely
people are actually, their
compared
life
to
expectancy is going down.
compared to what date? Compared to the 1970s, they've gone way up in terms of life expectancy, way up in terms of wealth, way up in terms of all sorts of things.
No, well, wealth is something different. You have to actually look at people's purchasing power, what they spend on it. For example,
and when you dig into that,
in Britain were liberalized, as it called, privatized. Right now, it turns out that people in England spend what was it, a month, almost 300 to 350 pounds on public transport.
Yeah, well, again, in terms of buying power, I'd refer you to some economists' attempts to re-estimate that, and what they generally find is that we tend to overestimate inflation and underestimate that the buying power changes, or the positive buying power changes in our what do you call it? I think Baumol has done work in that regard.
So
But my point is that
some study, but I'm sure there's some study, Kyle.
Well,
What
okay.
about all the people who are fucking pissed off? The
Yeah.
yellow vests, people that are protesting because the prices go up, and now they feel it much more than they used to.
Sure. So the yellow vests are objecting to a crazy carbon tax idea or gasoline tax idea by Macron and by the left, broadly speaking, and that's also the case for the tractor rebellion in the Netherlands, and I think for other things like I think Trump was in part like a response to attempts to restrict carbon, right? He's the drill baby drill candidate. He's for keeping American coal, all that sort of thing. And that rebellion is a rebellion that I very much like and agree with. I think that the left's environmentalism is a disaster.
Yeah, but the problem is this. I mean, these kinds of policies are added up on a whole program of not letting the lower and middle classes breathe already for quite some time. I mean, the reason why people are voting is not just because they have, I don't know, 20 euros less than they used to, but there's already a whole lot of measures that make these people already more poor than they used to be.
I don't believe
it's much more of a trigger than it is an actual that it's the only problem that there is.
But they're not poorer than they used to be, and also, like if you look at like socialism, support for socialism in America, it basically came on the heels of some of the biggest economic growth and the most evenly distributed economic growth in America. Well, even distributed, maybe not, but at least it reached the bottom of society in a big way. And actually, what you tend to see is that people who are the beneficiaries of growth often get uppity, often get the idea that they deserve more and more and more and more and more. And so the notion that the reason why.
What do you mean by that? Sorry, I don't understand what you're meaning by that.
I mean that people will always say that people are protesting because they got poorer, but often it's because they got significantly richer, but then the growth stopped, and then they felt like they deserved more.
Well, I mean, it can be falling expectations. I mean, in the 60s, you know that your child was going to do better than you. Now it's not so clear for a lot of segments of the population. I think for still the top 25%, everything is going better, but that's also where the policies are made for and who are actually in the parliaments. But I think for the other, 60, 75%, it's a bit more difficult.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that this is basically like your standard economic doomsaying, but I think it just ignores the broader story, which is of a society that's becoming healthier and wealthier over time. Becoming longer lived and having bigger houses and having down to the bottom, having better health care, better living conditions, things like infestations and diseases are radically down. It's never been better for the bottom of society, in my view.
But for example, economists like Piketty.
Yeah.
Would you just their whole research about people not having more wages since the 70s?
Yeah, I think that's incorrect. First of all, I think it's incorrect. But second of all, a lot of Piketty's objections are to wealth concentration. I think that's the lion's share of his objections are how returns to capital are exceeding growth, right? How and that's creating a wealthier and wealthier class of people. And my perspective is that you don't have business objecting to the wealth of other people. I think that those objections are morally and practically deficient. I think that a society that engages in trying to pull down their exemplars is going to do a lot worse than a society that embraces success.
Yeah, the problem is it is success made by, I would say, largely the public sector.
Disagree. But what do you mean made by the public sector?
Well, we start with roads, right? People drive roads to school even. People profit from the education system. It's not like, some people just do good in isolation. No, they do good in a network of society.
Right, but
they're also how would you say responsible for that system and to let that system thrive.
Right.
I think we're not just isolated individuals.
No, we're not just isolated individuals. But the question is, what credit should be apportioned to an individual for the gains that they accrue? And I think that question is sort of solved empirically by looking at what happens to different countries that take different attitudes. The countries that take the attitude that people you didn't build that. Responding to success by reaching out a hand and saying, "Hey, you owe me You owe me. That wasn't yours. Those societies don't do as well as those that ladle out credit and rewards for successful people. And so the answer is that
Which
yes,
societies are you talking about?
Comparing capitalist societies to socialist societies primarily, but also comparing America to Europe, like Western Europe.
I'm not so sure America is doing so much better in a lot of metrics. Actually, I think
It certainly seems more
the
impressive.
concentration of wealth is very much, or the wealth is very much concentrated in a few particular areas like Silicon Valley and other places, or the New York area. I would really love to see the GDP of the different provinces, and also how the wealth is actually distributed in these places.
Well, sure, but I mean, that also applies to Europe. So I assure you, when you take the poorest American states and then compare them to the poorest European states, the poorest European states look much worse.
Yeah, but you have to ask the question: is that because of economic policy, or are they large cultural factors playing a role in these matters?
But
Right.
let's rest on this for a little while. You object to the inequality of America, where New York and Silicon Valley are running away from the pack, but I point out that Europe is actually way worse in that regard, like infinitely worse. Like the poorest European countries are way worse off than the poorest American states, and so
Yeah,
let's
but
just
we're
sit on
talking
that
about
for a little
Eastern
bit.
Europe. Yeah, but we're talking about Eastern Europe, countries like Greece.
Yeah, the
that are-
EU,
that
the
have never
EU versus
been
the
part of
US,
West
right?
before.
Those are the comparisons, right? Those two
Let's compare
entities.
Western Europe. Let's compare Western Europe.
Okay,
If we're
then why
comparing
can't
it all.
I say well let's compare Western Europe to Silicon Valley and the coasts, the American coasts.
Well, because we're talking about Eastern Europe that was part of the communist regime for a long time, right? There was not a lot of economic.
Greece was part of the communist
growth.
regime for a long time.
What?
Greece was part of the communist regime for a long time.
No, but Greece has other social factors. I mean, Greece is not.
How
even
about
part
South
of
Italy?
historical Europe. South Italy, I would say South Italy is a very clannish culture. I don't think their economic policy, because if you look at Italy, actually, that's interesting, because we have a federal government in Italy that has the same policy, but you have different outcomes culturally.
Let's see.
Got mafiosos there.
Louisiana GDP per capita is $44,000. Spain's GDP per capita is $28,000. So I think Louisiana is one of the poorest states in the Union, and
Like
Spain is way poorer. And then yeah. So I don't know.
But Spain also. I mean, Spain. Till when did Franco still rule in Spain? I mean, it's not like how would you say an interesting example of social democracy or.
Yeah, well, America has
or
its
even
historical problems too,
liberalism,
but
for that matter.
yeah, sure, America has its historical problems as well. But I guess yeah, I mean, I just want to just reflect briefly on the idea that when you look at very large regions, you tend to find trouble spots, and American trouble spots don't look to me like actually America looks better than the best place I can compare it to, which is Europe. And I mean, you're welcome to take any other place in the world. I think that it gets worse if you go anywhere else in the world and try to find a place, a region comparable to America, and say whether it's more unequal or whether it's just worse off overall or whether it's better in any way. I would say America compares favorably on every dimension.
I'm not so sure about Japan or.
You think Japan is the comparison here, and not like East Asia?
Well, but yeah, of course, we have to compare modern society.
No, well,
You can't compare
modern
a
East Asia.
country like China with a crazy despot like Mao, and then just
Well, sure I can,
40
but
years of economic growth.
yeah, sure, but I can. I can say that.
Well, you can, but it makes it a bit silly.
Well, no, but actually, it's not silly at all. Like looking at inequality within China is an interesting comparison because that's a country where the attitude was for a very long time. You didn't build that. You have to understand that you are basically forced to be an extension of your nation, and you owe everything to the state or to the leader and all that. That was their attitude, and they're actually a lot less equal than we are here in America.
Yeah, but then I can also say, well, what about Russia? All right.
Yeah, Russia
Right?
is also a lot less equal than we are, right? So
Yeah, but Russia had in the 90s this great change in the neoliberal politics. It didn't work out really well, did it?
well, I don't know if I'd exactly call it neoliberal politics as opposed to a lot of looting of state industries, right? Which is a
privatized,
problem
right?
of having an oversized state. But like again,
What do
we're
you mean the state was cut down?
exactly. It was looted by looters, right? By people who were grabbing what used to, the whole society was concentrated in the state, and then in basically seizing that from the state in like another act of theft as opposed to creation, you have great inequality, and that's worse than what you have in America, where people build their wealth based on entrepreneurship and on creating value for people around the world.
Yeah, but I think people, the neoliberals also in the United States, they forget what they owe to the state. I think they forget what happened
I don't think
from the.
I think that they have about
On
the
the
right
30s
attitude towards the
onwards.
state. I think that there's a straw man, which is that they believe that there's no need for a state at all. But I think that in practical fact, the conservatives have a pretty good notion of what the state needs and what the state doesn't need. I think that they're actually pretty spot on what the place of the state is, and it's not the elimination of the state at all. Right.
Well, they were in favor of deregulating just before the financial crisis, right? We had Alan Greenspan.
As was Clinton, right? Clinton was the spearhead of that deregulation effort, if I recall.
But you're very right. But what happened with the Social Democrats and same with the Democratic Party in the United States is that we actually went on board with the Thatcher train, and I think that was the big mistake. I think that was the
I
big.
just had a couple questions when you guys are done.
Oh yeah, but please ask your questions, Mike.
Yeah, sure.
Just finish up, or I don't want to interrupt.
No, it's okay. You already interrupted.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at like say somebody like Nick Fuentes, who kind of does bring up some good points that take bravery to bring up, but it's like that paleoconish area. It seems like throughout history, or even on the Luke show, some of those good ideas they always get infested with, like World War II revisionism or even the Holocaust stuff, which
Yeah.
it's like they can't resist it. You know what I mean? It's just
Well, the reason is that
And
it's
even
not that
somebody
Nick
like-
Fuentes is bravely bringing up these issues. He's just dishonestly claiming that Charlie Kirk and Dan Crenshaw and these conservatives are something that they're not. He's claiming that they're like these open borders liberals trying to sell the country to Israel, all that stuff. It's lies. It's just abject, disgusting lies. So he's pretending like he's this brave soul speaking truth to these individuals when these individuals are actually working and putting themselves on the line to try to control immigration and to try to bring America to the best place it can be, right? Like Nick does not have better prescriptions. He just pretends like he's arguing against open borders people. That's just exactly what happens to me on the Luke Ford show. Is that people like Brundlefly, etc., would just pretend that they're talking to an open borders liberal whenever it suited them. They just lie about what my positions were, even after I said it again and again and again. That their strategy is just to lie and say, well, these Jews, they just want open borders, and whatever they say they want, I really know what they mean. But of course,
and your 3 passports,
it's just a lie.
blah blah blah.
Exactly. Yeah, they're just liars.
And like Pat Buchanan, who's a smart man, right? I wasn't really familiar with some of the stuff he said, but some of the World War II revisionism that he said it just seems.
He was
so
also
stupid.
like a huge sympathizer of like Palestinians. He was saying like Israel is evil and stuff like that. It's just fucking bullshit, man. Like it's just insane. It doesn't make any fucking sense. And then they say the conservatives don't have any principles, but they're the ones without any coherent worldview or principles. And the only way to make sense of it in a lot of cases is just to posit that they're liars, and liars in a very deep way in terms of advocating for things that they don't actually advocate for, but basically using advocacy as a shield for their real platform.
I forget what the book's name was that Pat Buchanan wrote about the Second World War. What was the name again? The Unnecessary War or something?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, and he argued that we should have made an accord with Hitler against Stalin or something. I thought it was something of the kind.
Put the blame more on, similar to maybe David Irving, put the blame more
but blame
on
it all on Britain.
Britain and the U.S.
I remember that, and he also had some ideas about polygamy, which I also found was laughable. That Western people should be polygamous. In a weird way, I would always think with these really trad cats that they're never really trad in the Western tradition. They always want to borrow something from the Muslims or something. It is a weird phenomena, and even with Pat Buchanan, that's the case.
Crazy. Actually, Kyle, I was curious. You can read a little bit about KMG online and stuff, and he's talked a little bit about his past. I guess he stuck up for some Canadian conservatives that kind of got kicked out of the movement because they sort of dabbled in, I don't know, historical revisionism and stuff like that. So they got
what, of the Holocaust or what? Oh, it was like a
guys like I can't remember their names because they're Canadian, but. Do you know anything about? And then he got, maybe he got unfairly painted. I know he wrote that article about. I mean, I think when people say dumb things, maybe they should be corrected and they disavow what they say. I don't really like unpersoning people. Like maybe that happened to Kevin or other people. I don't think that's fair. But
yeah, I'd have to see what Kevin actually said, right? But yeah, I mean,
was it about Ernst Zundel?
It might, yeah. There was a guy named Christie who was maybe Ernst Sundel's lawyer, and he was and Kevin thought it was unfair to kind of kick them out of the conservative movement.
What did they do?
Similar to the way.
Were they like paleocons, exactly, or were they like further right than? Oh yeah, whatever. Yeah, I can't really comment.
It probably ran the gambit, but I mean, I think when people reach a certain point, they're kind of unredeemable just for optics, but.
Yeah, but not just for optics, but in terms of like if a country has values and the people are completely diametrically opposed to those values, and then they also advocate a course of action which is immoral and vicious, right? Which is the case, I think, for the Groypers. Then that's worth criticizing. That's worth bringing up. It doesn't mean that you avoid engaging with them, although people are welcome to do that. It does mean that you address the issues with their perspective, as they're trying to do to you, right? But the difference is that in order to criticize their opponents, they have to just lie through their teeth constantly. And that's what's
I think it's interesting that criticism of Jews is also always hysterical. It's never on a normal tone. It's never like, hey, Jews, you should, I don't know, maybe not do this so much. Like, most of the time it's completely hysterical, and I think with this Groyper movement as well, I think they won't be able to contain themselves in the long run.
Well, they haven't, right? They've already covered them. Their leader has already covered himself in a whole lot of crap. But yeah, I think that part of the reason why criticism of Jews is always hysterical is that like if you're gonna bother to put yourself out there to that extent and piss off people to that extent, then you're probably going to feel very strongly about it. And in addition to that, there's it's not like unique to Jews. Whenever you have a more successful group among a less successful group, you have like incredible vitriol pour out on a regular basis. It happens to the Chinese in Malaysia, Indians in Uganda, Jews in old Europe, Igbos in Nigeria, basically everywhere. Whites in South Africa and Rhodesia, wherever you have a more successful group embedded in a less successful group, you have this sort of vitriol spill out, like without fail. And so I think that once you categorize it in that way, you get to understand it a lot better.
It's true, but the Jews have the ultimate conspiracy theories about them. I mean, what's really said about Indians compared to the Jews? You know what I mean?
Well, in Uganda, a whole lot, right? Wherever they are. So not a lot of Jewish conspiracies, I would suspect, in Uganda itself. Well, maybe, I'm recalling a certain Entebbe airport raid. Yeah, but maybe a bad example.
Yeah.
But in general, you see the conspiracies arise where the group is, and Jews are prominent in the West, and the West is important to the world. So I think
But
that's
what
the deal.
I think is very entertaining is that it's never just the Jewish conspiracy. It's mostly or almost always tied to other conspiracies as well.
Right. Well,
You see
people who are conspiracy
significant
minded,
overlap
yeah.
with moon landing, lizard people.
And 11.
I mean, this guy was it like Owen Benjamin, for example,
Yeah.
who went completely off the rails, and in the end also started to not deny moon landing. I think I'm not sure if he's flat
Yeah.
Earth.
And he's neither flat nor round Earth. He rejects the dichotomy. It's a false choice. You presented Owen Benjamin with a false choice, and he's seen through your lies.
It's genius. It's elliptical.
It's
or whatever you call it.
It's a multi-dimensional plane, whatever.
Not completely spherical.
No, but in this way, it does tie to mental illness, maybe in the way that hatred of Tutsis may not, right?
Well, sure. So I think that being anti-Semitic in old Europe was just a kind of a normal thing to be, whereas in America it's not. And you even saw that like from even like when neo-Nazis in America, not neo-Nazis, when Nazis in America coexisted with Nazis in Germany for that brief period, the Nazis in Germany were like these Nazis in America are very low class, uncouth, kind of embarrassing. That was their attitude, because you get a different sort of person when the views are socially accepted versus when the views are not, right? So in America you have kind of the special case. Like, I don't think it's true that in Poland to be anti-Semitic you're going to be mentally ill. I don't think that in Palestine to be anti-Semitic you're going to be mentally ill. In fact, in Palestine, if you're not anti-Semitic, I'd expect you to be some kind of weird iconoclast / troublemaker. But it depends on the societal norms. And America is a very philo-Semitic place, probably more philo-Semitic than Israel, right? Because there just isn't that contingent of extremely Jew-hating people. It's like the New World in general is like an incredible place for Jews, because the old hatreds basically weren't allowed to fester there, and so they could get a fresh start in the New World, not just in America, and that was very valuable for them.
Yeah, but then again, you have America's conspiracy theories now. Maybe I think it dates back from a long time ago. It started with Lincoln, and it has never. I mean, the JFK thing is notoriously famous, and I think, and Pearl Harbor, of course. I think Europeans tend to not be so obsessed by these things. I mean, they're obsessed as well, but not to the same degree.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that European anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish sentiment is probably more serious than American anti-Semitism, but America does do conspiracy theories more, and I'm not sure why that is, but I definitely do notice that trend that you talk about. I don't think it's particularly dangerous to Jews, though. Like, it seems to be a scattershot thing that basically targets the government more than anything else. The government seems to figure in these delusions the most.
Yeah, and you can also say that believing in a lot of conspiracies will delegitimize you for the other things you say, right? If you're considered a nut or a kook, people are not gonna believe the other things you say. So in a way, it is disarming the critique of the Jews, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, at least in a sense. But yeah, I think that, yeah, that thing I said earlier about the more successful groups embedded in less successful groups, you always have that kind of base antipathy that exists and it can be taken advantage of. But of course, a thing that's neglected is that there's also a base benefits. So like, it's not the case that universally you have these more successful groups be attacked. Often they do really well. In fact, most of the time they're doing really well. And then occasionally people will stir up trouble, and you just have to notice that and be able to expect it and handle it. But I think that the Jews in America are well suited to do that.
I'm not so sure. For example, you also have groups like the Freemasons and the Jesuits, who are always named in the same sentence as Jews, right? I'm not so sure that only their success is necessarily it's not necessarily the only factor. I think the
Were those?
idea that there's like this international element is
Well, Freemasons are very successful. Freemasons are very wealthy compared to the normal population, and Jesuits I'm not so sure, but I'm not sure about anti-Freemason sentiment. I've seen a fair amount of, especially in conspiracy places. I haven't seen a lot of anti-Jesuit sentiments. But yeah, like Freemasons fit that trend perfectly of being like successful people, and also like this secret club of successful people, which makes people really nuts.
Yeah, the secret club thing, and must be something.
Mensa would generate a lot of conspiracies if Mensa was was in any way like important.
You mean Mensa, the
IQ gated organization.
Mensa? The?
Yeah, if Mensa was like prominent and important socially in the way that Masons were in certain situations, then Mensa would be the subject of many conspiracies, in my opinion. It's perfectly suited for that sort of thing.
Yeah, I just heard a lot about the Bilderberg group as well. The Bilderberg group is always, and the Council of Foreign Relations is always.
It's another buzzword, the Bilderberg.
The Rothschilds, I hear that name.
Yep.
But yeah,
Rothschilds are responsible.
It's just your standard list of conspiracy theory associations. Anyway, but Conops, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, no, I had a discussion with Brundlefly about this, and he said he gave actually a quite good theory about it. He said that right wing people work maybe more with confirmation bias, and maybe leftism works more about saying, oh, this is an unfair generalization. So I think maybe on the extreme right, people are just looking at, would you say, confirmation of what they already believe, and Jew counting is, of course, how would you say, that has a big impact on something like that. I think that it is the definition almost as a confirmation bias. You just like say, oh, there's another one. I see a pattern. I see a pattern that is dangerous, and that's why we need to protect it. I think maybe this instinct is also responsible for a lot of the anti-Semitism we see on the extreme right.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely something to that. The right tends to basically deride or dislike explanations which try to make it into a coincidence, right? That's definitely the inclination of the right. But
yeah, I mean, it's the same thing as, for example, being on the savannah, and if you see the grass just moving, and yeah, I mean, if you have a right-wing instinct, you think, oh shit, it's a lion, I need to protect myself. And maybe if you have more of a leftist instinct, you're like, oh well, we can't always think about danger. We also need to be out there. We can't always, stay at the rock where we're at.
The right tends to be concerned about security, while the left is concerned about provision, right? But what I would say about what Brundlefly tends to do is to say, well, we're the true right because we understand the problems with the Jews, but the true right, the actual right, sees the problem with them, right? So this analysis can also apply to anti-Semites, conspiracy theorists, people like this. Like, they can be analyzed as a threat and as a problem and as troublemakers themselves, and that analysis actually hurts them a lot more than it hurts Jews, which is what they ignore. So the actual right eliminates them, right? The actual right is inclined to identify and eliminate troublemakers, and does identify and eliminate them, does identify and eliminate Brundlefly and his clique, right?
Yeah. Well, that might be true to some extent. Or we have seen periods in history where it didn't happen.
Right, but in America, it's happening.
Yeah, well, America doesn't have that. How would you say, great anti-Semitic tradition?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, so in countries that are more anti-Semitic, like the Philo-Semites are kind of the ones making trouble, right? And then Brundlefly tries to pretend, like, as always, a lot of these people's techniques depend on just pretending that something that isn't so is so. he pretends that this is like some European country. Like that's what they do so often. They pretend that America is just some European country, but America is America, and America has always been philo-Semitic, has always regarded Jews as part of its fabric, and has never had the anti-Semitic problems of Europe. So in Europe, yeah, like he you know, it would be very leftist to say Jews should be accepted, but in America, to be pro-Jewish is to be right-wing. It is to be in favor of the traditions and norms of the country that you're in. Yeah.
I wouldn't generalize about Europe in that way. I think.
Sorry, in some European countries, not in all
Yes.
Europe. Yeah.
I would say that really largely different. Danish or the Dutch don't have an anti-Semitic history.
I think the Danes. Who was it? Was it the Danes or the Norwegians who dragged their feet and didn't hand over the Jews?
Yeah,
Some-
they actually shipped them off to Sweden.
Right.
In safety. Yeah, the
Danes and the Belgium also helped a lot.
Right. So yeah,
Well, I mean-
different European countries have very different traditions, and that should be remembered. Yeah, and I'm sorry for glossing over that.
Yeah, it's always a problem. Like, I mean, on one hand, American, and on the other hand, you always have American conservatives says, "Are you Europeans?"
Kyle, do you have much of a connection to the Jewish organizations or life or
No, like almost
watch
none.
YouTube videos?
My sole connection to
Yeah.
or sense of kinship with Jews is just that I tend to find them in the intellectual circles that I'm in, just by coincidence. Not coincidence. It's just as I've said, there's a psychometric association between Jewish ancestry and you know, certain proclivities, especially like in terms of academic and political affiliations, and so I tend to find Jews where I am, but it's not because I'm seeking out Jews.
It's a coincidence.
Right. I mean, it's a coincidence driven by similar traits.
There's a lot in these circles, even, you know, your show, Luke's show.
Yeah,
Fair
like,
amount.
and it makes
Definitely
sense, right?
overrepresented.
So Jews are going to be, on average, smarter, but then in addition, they're also going to be more interested in politics, and in particular with politics as regards them, because whether they're interested in politics or not, politics is interested in them, and that combination of things makes them like doubly overrepresented, and it becomes cumulatively like more than the sum of its parts. You tend to see them in certain spaces way more than you'd expect to.
I would love seeing you on Bateman's stream, actually, Kyle. Would you go
Okay.
on?
Who's Bateman?
Yeah, Patrick.
Kyle has more
Beachman.
decency than that, but I would love to see it too.
Yeah, I'll just give you the link the next time I get the link.
I think I'm going to try to
Go on.
crawl up market, not down market. If he is down
Come on,
market.
you need to talk to these people. You need to wrestle in the dirt with these anti-Semites.
I've wrestled a
Come on.
lot in the dirt, man. I've been covered in mud. I've wrestled in the dirt a
Know
lot.
who these people are, Kyle? Bateman, you're familiar with that guy?
I think I've heard you talk about him he's like an extremist, basically.
Yeah, these guys are like the worst of the worst.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's, you know, the only step above Brundlefly.
I'm trying to crawl towards legitimacy here. I'm trying to go towards the light. Go towards the light, Kyle.
But he shares your dislike for Brundlefly as well. He wants to put his children in the oven.
Oh yeah, those guys. Oh my god. They wanted to microwave Brundlefly's kid, right? I think that's
Yeah.
a large part. Brundlefly was getting fucked from both ends. I think that was a large part of his defeat, was how he was trying to get to these fucking extreme anti-Semites and be like, yeah, the Jews, but then he's married to a Jew, so they fucking despise him, and yeah, he just couldn't find really kinship in any of the groups except for his own clique that was pre-existing. It's kind of the more morose type anti-Semites, right? That's kind of what Melky and him are like morose anti-Semites. That's like how I describe
They're
them.
kind of one step below in extreme. You know, they'll give you the opportunity to convert before they ship you out, so they're nice
Right.
like that.
Yeah,
That's-
very, very
I've
generous
heard
of them.
Say that.
Very, very generous of them.
But I mean, he has to deport the kid then, right?
Oh, he's Christian now. He's good.
No, but well, I don't know. But I mean, the old right has a very biological view of anti-Semitism. It's not that their culture is a problem. It's still
It's a
their
Christ
race is a
snatch,
problem.
Right.
If you accept Jesus,
Brundlefly,
you're
yeah.
all good.
Yeah, Brundtland has like a mix of like he agrees with the culture of critique, which says that biologically Jews are parasites, but he also hamsters away that and says, well, if they accept God, then, or if they accept Jesus rather, then they can be good. He has like a really hard hoe to row there, because of his acceptance of the culture of critique. At least as far as I know, he seemed to be the defender of the culture of critique and an attacker of Kaufman's.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. Well, I haven't read the whole book, Culture of Critique. I read the Kaufman's critique, and I read some chapters of the Culture of Critique, but I'm not so sure that he actually thinks that Jews have, how would you say, like a biological imperative. I think it's more that there's like a cultural
He called it a group
meaning.
evolutionary strategy,
Yeah.
which is a biological terminology, right? It's an evolutionary strategy.
Yeah,
They
that's
evolved to take advantage of other cultures, and so they're evolved to be parasitic, evolved to escape detection, but undermine their hosts. It's like basically standard Nazi propaganda. I was shocked when I looked at old samples of Nazi propaganda and actually thought, like, wow, this is a lot like the culture of critique. It's just a repackaging of like Nazi notions about the Jews.
No, that's definitely true. Yeah, it is basically the same. Yeah, but I mean, I've been rather critical from the beginning. I think when you went into these circles, you gave people a bit more slack than I did.
Oh, for sure, and that's largely because you're kind of on the left and I'm kind of on the right, and so I like initially I had the perspective that the left was slandering the right and just calling everyone Nazis for no reason. That was my starting point. But then gradually, I talked to them, and
Gradually, you became
there are a
the
lot of
hatred, right?
Nazis. So it's like
I
that.
learned from your learning curve, Kyle.
Yeah.
I mean, I gave them the benefit of the doubt and heard their ideas, and I was glad to go into a space where I could, give my critical thoughts of Judaism or Israel or whatever. But they just use that as an opportunity to use your words against you, I guess, or because they're not being honest, like that guy
Right.
on Twitter said who tried to talk to the alt-right. It's just combining truth with mostly conspiracy theory bullshit. So it's like,
Yeah, I mean, it's
Good enough.
repackaged Nazi propaganda
possible.
in large part. Like, basically, the succinct way to describe it is repackaged Nazi propaganda. And there's an existing affiliation. Like, this is the real red pill. Is that from the beginning, like from when the Nazi movement rose in Germany, there was actually a Nazi movement in America, and a lot of these people are actually like literal descendants of that movement. Like William Luther Pierce was active for a very long time, and these people, right? There's not a lot of them, but they exist, and they form the core of these movements. It's just this continual kind of a neo-Nazi group, which says it's not neo-Nazi, but actually like has ties back to Norman Rockwell, and his associates, and it has all these same perspectives on Israel, where from the beginning they were saying Israel is this evil country, and all these Israel is all these atrocities. Like basically the way to tell is that like you have someone who's right wing but really hates Israel, and at that point it's like that's a perspective that is isolated to people of a very very specific bent, right?
Yeah, well, I
America.
think that's definitely true. I mean, and for Europe, it was the same for a long time. You had all these spur parties with, like the British National Party, for example, that had all these Nazis in them, and then they would talk about the Jews, and then it would get one seat and then disappear. And in Holland, we had a party like this as well, and they all disappeared until they gave this shit up and became more, how would you say, adult parties. Like you had parties like the Front National disavowed these kinds of things, and then they became bigger.
Right.
I'm just so surprised that these people, and I've talked to them for so many times, but they're just so, the reason doesn't touch them at all. And I just gave them so many examples, like look what happened in the 1990s, and they just don't want to learn.
They don't want to learn. They want to keep playing their game. And they'll keep playing and the thing is that they're going to keep playing their game indefinitely. And that's sort of what I came to realize on the Luke Ford show was actually it's basically the fate of all future right-wing movements. They're going to have to contend with this because they're not going to be silenced. There's no way to get rid of them. They're just going to be there doing their thing. And as as unappealing as it is, and it is very unappealing, basically right-wingers are going to have to contend with the Nazi accusation straight up, right? They're going to have to just contend with that and deal with it, and deal with those ties, whether they like it or not. And that's, it can be dealt with, but it may be like a fatal blow to our ability to fundamentally keep our countries in a good place. It's absolutely an atrocious finding. And, a large part of my anger on the Luke Ford show was the continual realization of how deep a hole the right, especially the dissident right, is in.
But did you ever wonder, I mean, sometimes I think they do have a point. I mean, the question that was asked to Charlie Kirk was about Israel, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, which country would you choose? And then I'm like, well, why can't you say, I'll choose America?
He did.
If it ever comes to it, worst case scenario, I would nuke Israel if America was in danger of Israel nuking the United States.
But I believe that
why can't you say something like that?
He or Dan Crenshaw was asked this question and actually said, of course, America. But then continued on to say, well, Israel is our ally, and we value Israel and all these things. But I think that one out of the two times I saw the question asked, one time it was they demurred, and the other time they said straight up, of course, America is the first priority. But yeah, so
yeah, because I think
not every question is answered perfectly, but that question has been brought up multiple times, and I've seen it answered by the conservative wing, saying straight up, of course, if you're putting it a comparison, America comes first. But
yeah,
a lot of this is like,
I mean, for a lot of people who don't have any anti-Semitic bones in their body, it is still strange if how would you say, if a question like that isn't answered straightforwardly.
Right, but it's like if you're asking like someone like the coach of a team or something like that, or someone like a CEO of a company, right? And you ask them, well, who comes first, your company or this company that is a good customer of yours? And of course, they want to just say, well, my company, but they also don't want to offend that other company. And it doesn't mean that other company is in fact in charge. It means that this is an awkward question to ask. First of all, it's awkward because it's implying that you're a traitor, and then it's awkward because you have to try to field this question without giving the questioner what they want and driving a wedge between you and that other entity.
Well, I understand that example, but the problem with that example is if these two companies have a bit too close ties, and if the CEO is suspected of, I don't know, also trying to do favors for the other company while he should just work for his own company, then it becomes a different question, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And then the question becomes like, is it true that America is acting anomalously good towards Israel? And I think the answer is no. Like, I think that I like the direct comparisons. Like, compare how America sacrifices when it's far away from Israel to how America sacrifices when it's close to Israel. And in fact, you'll find that the closest America has been to Israel is troops in South Lebanon. And the instant they lost a couple hundred men there, they were out forever. Whereas they've strode onward far longer in places like Korea, places like Vietnam, and then in places in the Middle East that are much further from Israel and much closer to the Gulf states, which are very important allies of America. So yeah, I think that
more strategic.
Go ahead.
I think there's more strategically to Israel than meets the eye, and that's obvious. They're kind of like our front line over there.
Well, they're a nuclear power.
It's not going to allow.
They're a nuclear power with important military technology. So, I mean, they're a nuclear power with important military technology that is culturally aligned with America in an important region. So they're important, right? And then in addition to that, they're culturally resonant, right? They're a big part of the strength of why like the Republicans like each other is that they share their love for Israel, and that's not something that's bad, right? There's this evangelical cohort that really, really likes Israel and is really enthusiastic about being pro-Israel, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, right? The notion that this is some sort of dirty thing is just crazy. right?
Yo,
There's
it's
nothing
not a
wrong
dirty
with
thing.
liking a foreign country.
No, this is not a dirty thing, especially. I mean, but the evangelical like of Israel is not just cynical, but I think it's also sometimes a bit dangerous.
Well,
And
but I don't think
some.
so at all. I don't think that it's dangerous. And I think that, yeah.
Well, look.
I mean, from the
look,
left perspective, maybe it's dangerous, but from my perspective, I think
No, but
it's just salutary.
from my perspective as a European, for example, look. So who do Europeans have actual big problems with? It's not Hezbollah. Actually, we haven't had any big problems with Hezbollah. We have problems with Sunni fundamentalists, and we have a very uneasy alliance with the Gulf states that pump out Wahhabi propaganda in our places, and we antagonize Iran with our relationship with Israel and the Gulf states. And then in the Syria situation, there were soldiers of Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda branch, for example, they were actually helped by the Israelis.
Right, but that was in the context of a wider Western attempt to help Islamist rebels in Syria. So I would agree with that attack on.
Dumb thing.
I would agree with that attack on Israeli policy. I think that Israeli policy was terrible, but I also think that it was part of a Western push for that, and it wasn't just the USA, but also Europe. And it wasn't because pro-Israel. There were other reasons to be anti-Assad than to be pro-Israel. It's a very long-standing feud, and there's also this Arab Spring thing, which is not an Israeli thing, which the
No, but the Israelis were the most sensible during the Arab Spring, I
Right.
would say.
yeah, they were actually very anti-Arab Spring as it happened.
Yeah, but
Europe was very pro-Arab Spring.
stance, and
Europe
particularly-
and left-wing American politicians were very pro-Arab Spring in the beginning.
Yeah, no, this was a huge issue, but I think the Israelis continued this policy after the Europeans started turning already, and then they attacked Hezbollah installations, and I really get that from a security point of view from the Israelis, but it's not so good for Europe necessarily. We want ISIS defeated. That's our priority. We have divergent interests, and it's also something that needs to be named.
Well, to a very limited extent, that's true. But again, like you could compare this with other misalignments. So one thing that you've, well, yeah, I don't want to pivot away from that. I think that again, Israel's attacks on Assad were in many cases, bad or not on Assad, but rather just the support for Islamist rebels, which did exist. What was a terrible thing. But on the other hand, it's not like Assad and Hezbollah don't have a place in this, where they're gathering up long range missiles, not to defend themselves against rebels, but to threaten Israeli security. And so Israel is defending itself, and Israel's defense of itself is. I don't really see how. I don't believe that Israel's rather minimal defenses of its national security amount to spilling refugees onto Europe. I think that Europe's own stances have way more to do with that.
Of course, and I think nobody in their right mind would say it, except of course the alt-right, who would claim such ridiculous things. But like, I think a reasonable critique is that Israel's how would you say is Israel's policies towards Islamist rebels, and we're not just like the most. I mean, I know that we Europeans gave weapons to a coalition, and Jabhat al-Nusra was part of that coalition. But Israel actually helped them in hospitals and shipped them back.
Right.
I
I think
mean,
that those are comparable
after
things, though. I
Jews
think that
complained.
actually, like, the weapons are probably more useful to them than the hospital care. But I think that it's likely that covertly Israel probably gave them supplies as well as hospital care. I think that there was probably more to that than met the eye. And so both Israel and Europe were very self-destructively undermining the Assad regime, in my mind, very self-destructive and abhorrent foreign policy. But I would add to that, like, yes, it's true that by being associations with Israel make it harder to be friends with Iran. But let's not pretend like Iran is not making it harder to be friends with Iran, or like Iran's whole stopping point is Israel. That's not really the issue that stands between Iran and the West. There's a whole long history of wrongs back and forth between the West and Iran. And Iran has played no small part in the escalation there. Europe has tried desperately to be on Iran's side again and again and again, and Iran rewards them by attacking oil tankers and Saudi Arabia. Iran has. If Iran doesn't want rapprochement, then no one can force that on Iran.
Oh no, that is true. I mean, definitely there's bad blood, and I mean, the ideology of the revolution is not dying or is not dead yet. So of course, I mean, the idea that if we're just starting to be nice, then magically they will just fall in our arms and kiss us. It's just ridiculous, of course. But I think the way we go, sometimes the way we support Israeli policy, and the way, maybe much more importantly, we support Saudi policy, right? For example, in Yemen, it's
but
a ridiculous war, and has costed lives of so many people,
but keep in mind, Russia is offering to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia as well. So the question kind of becomes: is anyone willing to more. Is anyone willing to conquer Saudi Arabia and take the oil? Because if not, they're a gigantic economic powerhouse in terms of just their oil production, which will go to one side or the other. And it's not like any side is really pressuring them. It's not like there's anything to contrast us with that's better. It's not like Russia is pressuring Saudi Arabia and saying, "Hey, if you don't shape up, we're not going to sell you anything." Russia is begging to sell them stuff, right? So like, the Saudis are kind of their own actor. And absent us invading them and conquering them, which is really out of the cards, we are beholden to them to a significant extent. They could take all that money that they spend on European and American defense contractors and spend it on Russia and China. They could do that, and that would change the dynamic for Russia. It would be like a much bigger boon to Russia than it would hurt us, but it would also hurt us. So I don't know.
Wouldn't you think that might entice the Iranians for realignment?
Oh, I mean, yes, it would help realign the Iranians, but I think it's not the duty of Europe or America to give up significant boosts to their defense sectors in order to placate Iran, right? And you can make that decision, you can advocate that decision, but it doesn't seem to me to be an intelligent one, and it doesn't seem to me to end the conflict because the Saudis are still there and still hating Iran, just buying from different people.
Yeah, but I don't think that if we started to position ourselves a bit more neutrally in that conflict between the Saudis and the Iranians, I don't think there's any fear of the Saudis actually withdrawing all their oil to us or something like that. I don't think that's in...
No, not withdrawing all their oil from us, just changing who they buy from, patronizing the Russians more.
No, but why should we pay? Why should we pay all the time?
We don't pay all the time. We get paid. They're a massive injection into our defense budgets.
Well, we pay with our bloods on the European streets from the Wahhabi ideology that comes from Saudi Arabia.
Well, that's true. But by the way, WT, you're making some noise.
Sorry about that.
You're hot micing. Yeah, you're gonna go to push to talk if you like, or just manually mute and unmute. If you want to introduce yourself, you can.
Oh, hi. So I've been a fan of yours and following your work for quite a long time now, and I just heard your statement about your thoughts about how you want to go to the light. You were sort of joking about that. So I was just curious about how you view the future of your your sort of internet activities and what sort of direction you want to go in.
Yeah, well, I think that ultimately...
A true Kyle fan!
Yes. We have a real Kyle fan, not like those fake Kyle fans. There was a guy named Kyle fan who frequents the far right streams, and basically he pretended to agree with me, but I'm sure he disagrees with me. I mean, I'm happy to have him on again, but Yeah, this is a true Kyle fan, a true blue Kyle fan. One found in the wild. Yeah, well, in terms of the future of my channel, ultimately WT, it depends on networking. So the reality is that streams grow through connections with larger audience pools. I am an outgrowth of Luke Ford's sphere, and I'm not going to surpass Luke Ford's sphere in size by just drawing from Luke Ford. And so I'll need to network. I'll need to get off my ass and connect and try to invite more and more prominent guests and get on other shows and stuff like that. But that's its own kind of difficulty. And so at the moment I'm kind of in a rut, if you like, or just in a period where I mostly just stay in my own circle and on the Luke Ford show and just kind of play those games a little bit.
Right.
Ultimately, it would be nice to get the conventional success and grow my channel and become just have a larger audience.
Right. So I'm just curious, how would you view your overall time with Luke's and in general being in these circles? Would you say would you say what sort of things did you learn, and would you say it was overall fruitful or a bit disappointing?
It was well, certainly it was disappointing relative to the dreams that I had or the maximum that I could have gotten out of it. But it was, I think, very fruitful overall. I'm very grateful to the opportunity that Luke Ford gave me, and to the insight that I was able to get from Luke Ford and from my other co-host, Kevin Michael Grace, and all of that. I think it's been a very valuable opportunity to learn about streaming. But I would say that I wish that the ideal thing would have been for the people who were pre-existing on the Luke Ford stream to be more persistent there and also avoid their antisocial attacks on me and the stances which were just beyond the pale. And if they could have done that, then I think that the Lucosphere could have really expanded and become a bigger and more dynamic place. But they chose the battle, and so instead of growing those cooperative muscles, I flexed my competitive muscles, and as I have many times before, just outboxed some opponents of mine, and am left with the loneliness of victory.
Right. How would you say you're like overall optimistic or sort of pessimism about various aspects? Like perhaps if one might be able to distill your belief system down to like maybe race realism, capitalism, and a sort of conservatism or reformism, as opposed to like a more radicalism that others in these circles might have. How would you say you're optimistic or pessimistic about each of those, both within the dissident right and within conservatism more generally? And where do you think they'll like win? That's sort of a lot to ask, but I was just curious.
Right. So I can speak to that. I would say that in engaging with people who have conspiratorial and extremely resentful views of society, I've been forced to reiterate sort of what I view as a sane, conventional view of society, a lot more than I typically would. What I would typically do, and what you saw me doing early on the Ford show, would be talk about the problems that we have, how while we are in a very good place, we are undermining the basis of our success. We are creating a circumstance that is likely to end in a civilizational collapse. And so that's the sort of thing that I would talk about, just on my own. But no plan survives first contact with the enemy, and people have their own votes about what they want to bring up. And so what's ended up happening is I've been put into the position of just having to defend basic sanity in terms of just analysis of society and what works and what doesn't work. I'm reminded of you can spend a lot of time learning about Econ 101 and also learning about how Econ 101 doesn't work. And so there are a lot of people who basically their only knowledge of economics is how Econ 101 doesn't work. It's like imagine if you learned about cars entirely by learning about how cars failed and crashed and burned and how their engines didn't work and how designs didn't work out as planned. That was your entire education. But you just like through that straw that narrow keyhole view of the world, your entire view is just through the failures, and that's what you see with so many intellectuals and people who are discussing things about economics and about politics, where they don't understand how things work and that things work, or even that things work. They have this kind of dream that everything's going to collapse in the next 10 years, and all economic growth is fake or irrelevant, and all the political philosophy is just nonsense. All the progress that's been made by Anglos and Americans is fake, and just broadly speaking, extreme and unwarranted pessimism that arises from basically just their entire education is all the ways that things can go wrong, and they never learned how things go right. They never learned that, in general, cars just work. In general, you can simplify it down to you put fuel in, the car goes from point A to point B, and there's nothing else that you need to know. Right? In general, it works, and in general, society does work. In general, we're not in a circumstance, a Mad Max circumstance, and I know what that looks like. I know what collapse looks like, and I know that we're not collapsing. I know that we're a highly functional society. I'm just worried that we're not going to stay there over the next few centuries if we undermine the basis of that stability. And so because of that. Instead of talking about that latter thing, I'm forced to talk about the former. I'm forced to reiterate just basic realities about our world, as opposed to talk about my prescriptions for how things need to change and how the world is on fire.
Yeah, that's I fully agree with that. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on, I probably have the relatively rare position within these circles of thinking, the rise of figures like Tucker Carlson. While it is good that they're talking about these sort of demographic issues, their anti-capitalism and their sort of very conspiratorial worldview has been a very, disastrous, catastrophic effect on the broader conversation and where it will lead to in the future for the right. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that and whether that's something you're concerned about.
Yeah, so Tucker has taken a very conspiratorial, very anti-capitalist turn, and I don't like that. And I think he's talked about it openly. He said, "I despise libertarians. I used to be one, but I despise them now." So he's taking a very anti-capitalist turn, taking a very anti-tech turn, and I think that's a real problem for the right. I don't think it's had a very destructive effect on the discourse.
Can I ask? Sorry to interject.
Go ahead.
In what way is Tucker Carlson really conspiratorial?
I would just say that when he thinks about when when he sort of tries to understand the various ways people act, he always tries to his instinct is to think that there is some greedy or selfish underlying reason behind that. And there's these specific quotes that ring distinct to me about why. I mean, um, why do leftists, or why does the general conversation about leftism and identity issues predominate instead of talking about these sort of economic issues? And he says that, it's some conspiracy by rich people to you know subvert people's class interests or class
Right.
conflicts.
A big example would be in terms of like feminism. He says that the reason why we have low birth rates and why we have women out of the home and women working is because the capitalists schemed to take them out of their natural role in order to make money. Right. Whereas that's like the exact inverse of what happened. Right. What happened was that this basically hiring women was forced upon business by a social movement. Right, business was starting out being, very oriented towards hiring men, and when the men came home from the war after World War II, the businesses fired the women and took in the men. But then a social change happened, and that was no longer an acceptable attitude to have. But Tucker Carlson lies, or Tucker Carlson misleads and says that it's business that has led to the dissolution of the family, because Tucker Carlson has this kind of leftist view of the world. And let's remember that
I don't think it's a conspiratorial view. It's not a conspiratorial view at all. I think it's a very sensible view. Of course, other things play a role. but you can't say that capitalism in itself doesn't have a incentive to have more production value, and women
Right,
in
but the way that it was
workforce.
doing that was through using men more and more efficiently and keeping women in certain roles. Right, that was the way that capitalism was working, and then society, politics came in and said, no, capitalist, you cannot isolate women to these roles. You must hire them for this, and this, and then you had the integration of women into the workforce in full. But the notion that it was the evil capitalists who caused the social change is just not true. The capitalists
I think
again
it's
and
a
again are
large
forced
part
to
of the
scurry
change.
for the politicians.
No, I think because of the pill and because of these new economic incentives, it was just much more valuable for women in the workforce. And of course, society adapts. So I think it's much more of a structural explanation than it is a conspiracy theory. I don't think it's
Okay, well, no,
conspiracy.
no,
Like,
but
even
no,
if
no.
you don't think.
But the way that Tucker Carlson put it was that this was a scheme by businesses to make money at the expense of the nation's future. They said, "Oh well, who cares if the women don't have children? We need them in the workplace. We're gonna scheme and conspire to get them into the workplace." Whereas that's very much the opposite of how it worked out. It was not the capitalists that were the driving force behind getting women into the workplace. Rather, it was a social movement, and obviously the pill. But the pill was also part of a social movement. The pill was funded the pill's creation was funded by feminists actually, and
But can I wait? Can I
it
not?
was a social thing. It
But
was a social
I
movement
can
to
equally
make women do
yes, but
that.
I can. Okay, but I can equally frame your vision of how you think it happened as an intellectual conspiracy.
Right, but the question is simply the truth of the matter. Is it true that businesses schemed to get women into the workplace, or is it true that this was a social movement that was foisted upon businesses and businesses obliged and if anything, the criticism that could be laid against them is that they failed to stand up and stop it, as opposed to that they created it. Right, that is a question that is valid. Like, is that true or not? Is Tucker Carlson's perspective true, or is mine true? And I think that Tucker Carlson's
Well,
perspective is false and is part of a wider leftist worldview and a conspiratorial worldview, if you like. I think that they're kind of the same thing that he actually shows.
but I think it's not. I think you're really framing this view in a conspiratorial manner, and you shouldn't. Well, you don't have to necessarily go there. I think you can as easily turn it around. You can just say, well, women in the Second World War had to, and the First World War had to keep the capitalist production system up, and then later they found out it was too valuable to not let go. And of course, the
Well,
society
if that was the
adapted
case,
accordingly.
then they wouldn't have fired all the women and taken on the men, but they pretty much did.
Yeah,
Right.
but society slowly changes. So what?
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely. And it was that
the
change
fact that something
that
is
forced the.
also makes something at some point. Social values adapt, and at some point, it's like, oh shit, maybe it's not so wise to have all these women back in the workforce. They found out.
Well, no.
So
Well. I obviously it has to do with the profitability of having them as workers. That is inseparable from the fact that we have women in the workplace today. But the question is, what was the driving force behind the change? Was it capitalists saying, "Ooh, I see how to make more money," or was it a social movement that said, "You must accept women. Women have to have equal rights. They have to have equal representation."
For race realism, and now increasingly defending capitalism. Do you think? How do you think this bodes for reformist democratic efforts going forward?
By the way, I think the stream cut out, but it should be back now. Sorry. Yeah, I was distracted by that. How do I think that race realism and pro-capitalism will interact in the future?
Yeah, especially with regard to the sort of democratic, small d democratic focus, like winning, getting party
Of having them
alignment on
as
certain
workers.
issues,
That is
especially as older generations
inseparable
die off and
from the fact
sort of more
that,
less capitalist youth enter even the right.
right. So there are going to be a lot of forces fighting against each other here. Here I am given hope by the success of the neoliberal movement, actually. a lot of and also the libertarians, there's a lot of success in terms of appealing to kind of the elite or the decision makers or politicians or business people. You can appeal to them and make a big difference. And in those terms, my hope is not to change the overall politic. In fact, I don't want eugenics. I don't want, which I define as state mandated reproduction or state mandated sterilization or any such coercive measures. I in fact advocate that people who have the means should actually go ahead and just do it themselves, paying for it themselves, in the manner that a entrepreneur-funded space program has become possible. It has also become possible to fund very salutary efforts in regard to say trying to increase IQ through breeding or through reproductive incentives or through stuff like that. It could be done privately, and actually that's the only place to focus in my mind. It's the only moral and practical way forward.
Positive eugenics.
Yes, exactly. Well, okay, but Conops, the issue I have with the term positive eugenics is that eugenics in and of itself to most people means that coercive negative eugenics or sterilization thing. So I just entirely avoid the word eugenics for that reason. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's just an issue of definitions. I want to be clear about what I mean, and I don't mean coercion.
Have you been following this, just going on this broader theme of people like Tucker and the sort of, change or decay in certain ideas? Have you seen this whole national conservatism thing? And would you say that's overall a force for good or bad? Because while it is, sort of discussing these more greater nationalistic ideas, it does seem extremely infused with, maybe extreme is too strong a word, but quite infused with anti-capitalist sentiments. Like if you know of this Journal of American Greatness, where in the past, Michael Anton had posted this piece that's run by this person called Julius Krein. Are you aware of these things, and what's your general opinion?
So far, I've had a mildly positive perspective on national conservatism. I believe it's sort of Yoram Hazony's pet project, but I could be wrong about that. My knowledge about it is relatively limited. I would say that so far it just hasn't mattered very much, and I'm in favor of more nationalism and with more conservatism. And I think that the national conservative philosophy so far, in terms of its anti-capitalism, so-called, has mostly been anti-capitalist in the sense of being skeptical about GDP gains from open borders. But maybe there may well be stuff that I haven't seen. So far, I'm cautiously optimistic about it, but I also think its relevance is very, very low. I think its relevance does not approach the relevance of even like a pundit like Tucker Carlson or Ann Coulter so far.
And just sort of a final question, have you been following what's going on the American mind? Sort of two things, like there was first this Michael Anton Bronze Age pervert sort of thing.
Oh, I saw that, yeah. I saw
and
Michael Anton address Bronze Age pervert.
I must say that I was sort of underwhelmed / disappointed because
by who? Michael Anton or by pervert?
Maybe it's just me, but I find Bronze Age pervert quite a really bizarre and a very strange and very weird person, and I'm extremely surprised that there were like a dozen pieces trying to analyze and dissect his whatever strange community, and I was just baffled by this. And
I think that a lot of the energy behind the dissident right in general, or the alt-right, has been gets directed by Michael Anton and by others onto Bronze Age pervert, because he's kind of a bridge, right? He's kind of in the same sector as the irony bros in the sense that he's not exactly alt-right, but he's kind of adjacent. He's also like Moldbug in that regard, but he's also like a very I think I find him somewhat bizarre and shallow, but that's me. I want to circle back to an earlier thing you were talking about. You were asking about how capitalism is going to interact with growing anti-capitalist sentiment. I think that the basic reality is that while people may have more anti-capitalist sentiment, the position of large businesses is getting better and better by the fact that they have this enormous wealth and influence, and also just power that arises from the direct activities that they're engaged in. And so I see a large potential for these companies, these huge companies, to basically become almost like quasi countries in and of themselves, and so a lot of opportunities open up there, a lot of problems, but also a lot of opportunities. And I think that might happen regardless of the anti-capitalism of the that's in the air or among young people, because these companies simply have so much power and so much influence on the economy, too big to fail, so to speak.
Yeah, but
And
wouldn't it just fuel resentment, right? More
Well, certainly
resentment.
resentment,
The
but
bigger they
but
get.
also possibilities and also wealth. So
For who?
all these things. Fundamentally for the country, like the fact that America has such a dominant tech sector helps the country in general. But also just also for the people who are working for those companies and who are invested in those companies. So
Yeah, but the problem becomes that, I mean, they will become much more influential in the legislative branch of our governments, and
hopefully
their lobbying power will become bigger.
that'd be great.
And that'd be great.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
You think really big, almost monopolies like Google, like Facebook? It would be great if their power to lobby the American political establishment. You think that's a good thing?
Yes, I think that I like the caliber and the inclinations of the tech company executive suite more than I like the inclinations of the general public, and certainly more than I like the inclinations of the Democrat Party. In terms of the Republican Party, it's harder for me to say, but I would have to say that I like the stabilization factor of having these very powerful entities having their own influence and basically possibly just creating a gridlock situation almost indefinitely. That'll be fine. I really don't want politics to come in and kill the golden goose.
Up the competition. If you're a capital, this is the irony the neoliberals never understand. At some point, these companies are just monopolies, and then you have state socialism.
No,
or
like
corporatism.
for example, Ma Bell was a huge monopoly, right? But Ma Bell was the father of a huge amount of innovation, and so eventually you could get to a point where the companies are too big, but they have to get a lot bigger for me to be worried in that regard. I'm not afraid of what you call monopolies. I think that businesses dream of being monopolies fundamentally. They dream.
What do you mean you're not? But they won't get much more effective, because what they do is they will buy up the competition. You see this with WhatsApp and Facebook, right? So WhatsApp becomes a competitor. What does Facebook do? They buy it up. Everything that becomes a potential danger and a potential competitor becomes, and then they become lazy and they lobby the political establishment for more Gibbs.
Yeah.
And then they become hugely ineffective. Then you
Well,
basically have state
you call it
socialism.
Gibbs, but essentially what they're lobbying for is to not be broken up. They're not really lobbying for Gibbs. They're lobbying to not be
No,
broken up.
that's not
And
true.
I'm in
That's not
favor.
true. I'll give you one example of my country, right? So we had a dividend tax that we for Royal Dutch Shell and two other companies, and they said if you didn't give us this tax break, we'll move out. And basically, because these companies are so huge now, they can just manipulate the political the political scene to such a degree that actually, as a country, you lose autonomy.
Yeah, well, I'm not worried about that happening for the U.S. I would be worried about that if I was anyone but the U.S., but what's essentially happening is that everyone is kind of becoming the U.S.'s bitch because of this economic circumstance. The U.S. is like, basically has made itself the only legal tax haven in a lot of ways, has basically cucked all the other tax havens and has created like itself as the monster tax haven, and its companies are the monster companies, and they bully around everyone else, and that's fine for me. I'm an American chauvinist.
No, but it's gonna be a race to the bottom, because smaller countries are also gonna say, hey, look, we're not gonna give any, we're not gonna ask you any taxes.
No, because America bullies smaller companies. So, for example, like Switzerland tried to be private and hold wealth without revealing it to the U.S. The U.S. just bullied them into accepting extremely stringent
Well, the Netherlands
revelation.
is still doing it.
No,
Little
the
small
point is
islands, like
the point is that if it ever
okay,
becomes
then-
if it ever becomes a
then-
large
then-
problem, the U.S.
this
can
is
bring its
Kyle's
might to
world.
bear, whereas other countries can't.
All right.
Other countries can't. Like the problem of capital flight is a much bigger problem for the competitors of America than for America. You call it a race to the bottom,
So
but
why
I,
is the
I
intent-
like
why-
I like
why-
the big tech companies. Conops, I like the big tech companies. I like the capitalists. I think
I
that they're
know,
broadly
I know you
speaking
do.
competent and
Well, you're not a capitalist.
there's some merit there.
Kyle, you mentioned Moldbug, on American Mind. I'm curious what your thoughts on his articles are.
I've liked some of them or some of the insights in them. I kind of tend to agree with Greg Cochran that Moldbug has a bit of a screw loose in some places. His conclusions on history and foreign policy and also certain political philosophy conclusions are faulty in my mind, but he does point to a lot of things. Like he's kind of like Scott Alexander in the sense that he points to various concepts, and in doing that, he's actually elucidating things, even if his conclusions are faulty.
Yeah, personally, I found.
All right, I'm gonna take off actually.
Good night, Conops. It must be late where you are,
This is
isn't it?
nasty.
Is it late?
Yeah, it's fucking late. I should
Jesus.
have gone to bed a long fucking time ago.
Yeah. Well, it was a good conversation, man,
All right,
and thank you so much for coming back on. Bye.
Thank you, Kyle, and see you later, guys. See you later, Mike. Bye bye.
Later.
Wow. Like, what's the time now in the wherever he is? Denmark time.
It'll be like 7 a.m.
6:34 a.m. Jesus. Amazing. I got my I don't have that many fans, but what fans I do have, they're passionate. they got passion.
Yeah.
Right. I make up for quality what I lack in quantity. Anyway, WT, any more thoughts? I think I'm going to be wrapping up fairly soon, but
Yeah, so I was, I thought it was, first article was decent. It felt quite like a rehash of all his previous writings, but I found his second article just incredibly difficult to read and very circular and enormous numbers of tangents. And, I feel like he hasn't made enough intellectual progress since he stopped blogging. It seems very, stale.
right. Do you read Slate Star Codex?
I'm very familiar with this blog. Yeah, I think they might have. I probably would say that they have slightly different problems. I would say even though Scott is very long-winded, he doesn't have that peculiar, even more eccentric writing style that Moldbug does, and particularly on. I still see Scott as basically evolving to more and more reasonable positions, however slowly. But I think Moldbug has really fallen into a rut, and I think he's extremely depressed by, the relative lack of effect his writings have had, and just the general state of the blogosphere not having been very successful in influencing political thought and the political culture more generally. So,
Have you read Ender's Game?
Ender's Game. I watched the movie, but no, I haven't read.
Oh
the book.
no. Well, that wouldn't. Well, in Ender's Game, there's a dynamic where basically these anonymous blogs are a huge thing in world politics, and I think it was an inspiration for a lot of people. But yeah, I think that the blogosphere has kind of tanked, and there is that unfortunate thing where people kind of reach their peak and then never recover it. But I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with Moldbug to be able to say that whether he's peaked or not. I've read some of his posts on unqualified reservations, but not all of them. And but yeah, my main feeling is that he's elucidated certain things, but since then his relevance has rather disappeared.
Right.
I was just going to mention real quick, totally agree with your sentiments on Tucker. I like Tucker, but I feel like he's making these economic populist arguments that are kind of popular, but, economics is complicated, right? And nobody wants to see a company go out of business and workers be put out of work, but obviously you understand the collective gain that comes from the dying and creation of new
Right.
industries.
I was talking to a friend of mine. Like there are basically two bright spots in technology. One of them is AI, quote unquote, but more specifically just machine learning and computer vision and automation. And the other is space in terms of like radical progress being made technologically. And Tucker wants to kill one of them outright, which could kill the other one as a side effect. Right? I mean, it's just crazy. This is our ticket out. This is like the bright spots of our situation is that we are turning our massive wealth into practical progress in meaningful ways, and that's being done by the tech sector in America, and really nowhere else. Really, no one else is making a dent in these problems. But he wants to kill the golden goose because it causes him some disruption for this massive amount of wealth to be generated. It's like okay, dude.
So, Kyle, just one last question before I have to go. So, what would you say is your general emotional state about politics and just the way you sort of feel these days? Personally, I feel in a almost utterly despondent and um, what you might call failed, disappointed state about politics. You know, just in general. I'm curious how you feel.
Yeah. Well, interacting with far right radicals has really made me appreciate what sanity we have in politics. And so, for example, looking at the political field right now, I think I could be satisfied by Donald Trump, Peter Buttigieg, and probably Joe Biden all seem like they're basically sane. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders seem like they're dangerous. Hillary Clinton seemed like she was dangerous, but I think that the politics as it is now, I don't feel like I'm about to step on a landmine anymore, and that's really quite welcome. I think that the two Supreme Court appointees by Trump have really given us a lot of breathing room. But I'm also not very happy about where politics is either.
Right, and your point about Supreme Court appointees just reminded me of one little last thing I wanted to ask was, Trump has faced, most importantly, I feel that the federal judges and the way they've struck down so much of his initiatives and the bureaucracy, the way they've just sort of floundered and tried to slow their way towards preventing Trump from doing anything. I feel those are just endemic issues with the structural by the law way the system sort of works. So I'm curious, do you see any ways to resolve that in the future, or do you feel that I don't know. I sort of lost my train of thought. What was
Yeah,
saying?
so I think that a really germane article is the one that I just linked in the Discord, Trump Got His Wall After All, which talks about the change in culture in the Department of Homeland Security and in terms of the people who are in charge of granting visas. So this goes both ways, right? Trump has managed to change culture in the areas where he's focused, and if he gets another term, he can change them still more. It's sort of it's a gradual process, and of course, by appointing his justices, he has also changed the culture of America in a profound way. So gradually speaking, slow and steady wins the race. I do agree that Trump has been stonewalled. Trump has been mistreated in many ways by his intelligence apparatus and by the media. But let's remember that Trump had his own part in terms of antagonizing all of those entities which are going after him right now. So it's not like this just spontaneously happened to Trump for no reason except that he had the campaign or the platform that he had. It was also his own direct antagonization of these entities as well, and that certainly eases my anger at the process we're going under. One of the big inflection points was the Mueller report, when the Mueller report came out and did not recommend that the president be indicted. That was, I think, a demonstration of the soundness of our political system and our institutions to a significant extent.
Mm-hmm. And just one super last, just wild question. If you had to just wildly guess about whether, like 25 years from now, the world will in general be a better place, or America will in general be a better place or a worse place, what would you say?
Better, but a qualified statement. It'll be better in the sense that it'll be more wealthy, it'll be more knowledgeable, It'll be more healthy. People will be longer lived. There'll be all these benefits, but we will be 25 years closer to the eventual point where we can no longer sustain civilization with the group of people that we have in the West, or even, of course, in the East. It's not like the East has escaped from the patterns that are devouring ultimately the West. So yes, we will be wealthier, but we will need to use that wealth to get out of our current predicament, whether that be through massive technological progress or through sociological changes. And with that, I think I have to say goodnight to everyone, including you. It was great meeting you.
Yes, it was nice to talk to you as well. Goodbye, and let's hope that you're right about 25 years from now.
Yeah, hopefully. Good night, everyone.
Bye.